The Alchemist of the Underworld. A high school DxD/Shinobi world crossover. Act 1. The Philosopher's Crucible. Chapters 1-5. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Was Born Remembering. A soul that carries its own fire cannot be extinguished by the world it enters. The first thing Issei Hyoudou remembered about his new life was the smell of blood and pine resin. Not his blood. Not exactly. But the smell clung to whatever had come before, a ghost scent woven into the marrow of the soul that slid, screaming and indignant, into the cold body of a newborn boy in a land that should not have existed. He had been someone else once. A teenager in a city full of noise and vending machines and girls who smiled too easily. He had laughed too loudly, dreamed too simply, and died before he ever had the chance to understand how extraordinary the world truly was. The last thing he remembered from that life was a flash of crimson light, a roar so deep it shook the floor of his ribs, and then nothing. Now he was here. The village was called Kanhigakure, the Hidden Leaf. And from the very first moment, he could focus his infant eyes on the shapes above his cradle. Issei understood that he had not been reborn into an ordinary world. He could feel it in the air, a humming tension that ordinary people called the wind but that he recognized, with the instincts of his former life, as something far more alive. The shinobi of this world carried energy in their bodies the way a river carried current. It moved. It breathed. It answered intention. His family name was Hyoudou no longer. His mother called him Issei, and his father, a broad-shouldered jonin with calm brown eyes, called him Little Hawk because of the way the newborn stared at everything as though he was cataloging it for later use. That habit would never leave him. His clan name was Uchiha. He learned what that meant in stages, the way all difficult knowledge is best absorbed. The black fan symbol on the back of his father's flak jacket. The particular quality of silence that fell over a marketplace when an Uchiha walked through it, a silence made of equal parts respect and fear. The whispered stories told by older children about eyes that could see the truth beneath all lies. The Sharingan. The copy wheel eye. The heirloom of a clan that had been, depending on who you asked, either the greatest protectors the village had ever known or the proudest and most dangerous family in the entire land of fire. Issei listened to all of it, and said very little. That, too, would never change. He remembered the sacred gear before he remembered how to walk. It was not a physical memory. There was no red gauntlet on his tiny arm, no jewel gleaming on his fist, no voice rumbling up from the deep place where souls keep their oldest secrets. It was more like the memory of a color, or the memory of a sound you have only ever heard in a dream. He knew something had lived in him once, something immense and ancient and proud, a presence that had called him partner in a voice like distant thunder. He knew it had given him power, and he knew that power had been the axis around which his former life had turned. He reached for it on a winter morning when he was 3 years old, sitting cross-legged on the cold wooden floor of his bedroom while snow fell in steady silence outside the window. Nothing happened. He reached again, not with his hands but with the part of himself that he could not name yet, the interior space behind his sternum where something warm and coiled always seemed to rest. He pressed his awareness into that space the way you press a thumb against a bruise to find its edges. And there, at the very bottom of that interior silence, something stirred. It was not the dragon. Not yet. It was only an ember, a single point of heat that pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat buried under stone, and then went still again. But Issei sat very straight and let out a slow breath, and for the first time since his rebirth, he smiled. It was there. Whatever he had been, whatever power had defined him, it had followed him here. It had crossed the boundary between one life and the next and settled into this new body like a secret waiting to be excavated. He was 3 years old and he already knew, with a certainty that had no business belonging to someone so small, that he was going to spend the rest of this life digging. His father's name was Uchiha Ryota, and he was a careful man, not cold, not distant. Careful, which is a different thing entirely. He measured his words before he offered them, the way a craftsman measures a board before the first cut. He watched Issei with an attentiveness that the boy appreciated precisely because it never crossed into hovering. Ryota gave his son space to fall and enough presence nearby to make the falling feel survivable. His mother's name was Uchiha Setsuko, and she was the sharper of the two. She had warm black hair and a laugh that arrived without warning, sudden and generous, before retreating just as quickly behind the composed expression that all Uchiha women seemed to learn before their daughters learned to speak. She taught Issei to read when he was 2, because he kept picking up scrolls and looking at them with an expression of profound frustration that she found both amusing and impossible to ignore. By the time he was 4, he was reading faster than she could supply material. He did not tell either of them about his past life. He had considered it, in the measured way he considered everything, and concluded that the information would cause more problems than it solved. They loved him. He loved them. The past was the past, and the future was here, and the most efficient use of his time was to learn everything this new world had to teach him as quickly as possible. He was 4 years old, and he already had a research agenda. It began, as all his best ideas would eventually begin, with a question so simple it seemed almost stupid: what exactly is chakra, and can it be combined with something else? Chapter 2. Transmutation, First Principles. Every great discovery begins with the arrogance of a person who refuses to believe the current answer is the final one. There was a library in the Uchiha compound, and Issei had memorized its contents by the time he was 5. Not all of them were useful. Most of the clan scrolls dealt with tactical history, lineage records, and the maintenance of specific fire jutsu that the Uchiha had refined over generations into something approaching high art. These were impressive. Issei read them carefully and filed them away without much excitement, because fire was spectacular but it was also simple, a single element deployed with greater and greater force. Spectacular was not the same as interesting. What interested him were the scrolls on sealing theory. Fuinjutsu was, by any reasonable assessment, the most underappreciated discipline in the entire shinobi world. It was regarded by most practitioners as a support art, something you studied to contain things or transport messages or occasionally trap an enemy who was careless enough to step on an ink diagram drawn in the forest floor. It was considered secondary to taijutsu, secondary to ninjutsu, secondary to genjutsu. Something learned out of necessity rather than passion. Issei read the theory and felt the back of his neck go electric. Seals were not support art. Seals were the underlying language of the world. Every jutsu a shinobi performed was, at its root, a seal sequence, a pattern of intention impressed upon the physical world through the medium of chakra. The hand signs most ninja used to focus their techniques were crude versions of the same principle, training wheels for people who had not yet understood that you could speak the language directly. Fuinjutsu, practiced at its highest level, was not the art of trapping things. It was the art of writing the rules of reality, and convincing the universe to obey. He started practicing ink work at age 5, using a brush his mother had given him for calligraphy practice, and a pot of the cheapest sealing ink available in the compound's supply room. His first seal exploded. Not violently. It sort of unfurled, a rapid and enthusiastic release of the tiny amount of chakra he had managed to press into the ink, which resulted in the small square of paper shooting across his desk and sticking to the wall with a wet slap. He stared at it for a moment, then wrote in the small journal he had started keeping, "Ink adhesion factor requires calibration. Channel rate too fast. Try fractional compression on input nodes." He was 5 years old. His father found the journal a week later and read 3 pages before setting it down very carefully, walking to the courtyard, and standing in the cold air for a long time with an expression no one was quite sure how to interpret. The ember in his chest grew as his chakra reserves developed. This was not, he suspected, coincidental. The sacred gear, or what remained of it in this new life, appeared to be tied directly to his energy output. The more chakra he generated, the more the interior warmth strengthened, the more the ember resolved itself from a vague glow into something with edges and intention. By the time he was 6 he could feel it clearly enough to take measurements, which he did by sitting in perfect stillness for 30 minutes each morning and probing the space with the careful attentiveness of a physician conducting an examination. He noted his findings in the journal. Day 47. The resonance point stabilizes at approximately 3 centimeters below the sternum, and 2 centimeters inward from the surface. It does not behave like a chakra node. It behaves more like a sealed container whose walls are made of something I do not yet have a word for. The pressure inside the container increases when I am under stress, decreases when I am calm, and spikes briefly when I access fire chakra. Hypothesis: the remnant is reactive to specific energy signatures. Further testing required. He did not tell anyone about the remnant. It was not a secret born of shame. It was a secret born of the understanding that information, and properly released, becomes a liability. He was an Uchiha child in a compound full of adults who prided themselves on observational acuity. If he told his parents there was a dormant supernatural artifact embedded in his soul, the conversation that followed would consume enormous amounts of time and generate very little actionable data. Better to gather the data himself first and present conclusions when the conclusions were ready. He was 6 years old, and he already understood the value of a controlled release. The first real breakthrough came on a Tuesday in late autumn, which Issei would remember forever as the day he understood what he actually was. He was sitting at his desk with 3 scrolls open, a partially completed seal matrix spread across a practice board, and a cup of tea going cold beside his right elbow. He had been attempting to construct a 3-layered seal, not because he needed one for any immediate purpose, but because the theoretical architecture interested him. Most seals were single-layer constructions, one intention compressed into one pattern. 2-layer seals existed but were considered advanced work. 3-layer seals were largely theoretical, present in academic discussions but absent from practical application because no one had figured out how to keep the chakra flows from interfering with each other at the junction points. He had found the solution 4 days ago. It involved a specific angular offset at the primary junction that he had worked out by treating the problem as a wiring diagram rather than a mystical inscription. Tonight he was testing the execution. He pressed chakra into the first layer and held it steady. Then the second, calibrating the offset precisely. Then the third, and at the junction where all 3 met, he held his breath and waited. The seal hummed. Not metaphorically. It produced an actual, faint, resonant hum, like a string that had been plucked in a register just below normal hearing but that could be felt in the jaw and the sternum. And in his sternum, the ember responded. It flared. Not explosively. Not dangerously. It opened, like a fist uncurling, and for a fraction of a second Issei felt the full dimensions of what was sleeping inside him, something vast and patient and ancient, a consciousness so large that even its sleeping edge was enough to make his entire nervous system ring like a struck bell. Then it settled again, and the ember returned to its usual quiet glow, and Issei sat very still for a very long time with the brush still in his hand and the ink drying on his fingers. He picked up the journal. He wrote, "The remnant is not dormant. It is waiting. And it is watching." It responded to the 3-layer architecture specifically, not to standard single-layer or double-layer activation. This implies that the minimum activation threshold requires complexity, not merely volume. The entity within is not impressed by power alone. It responds to precision. He underlined the last word twice. Then he wrote, in smaller letters beneath it, "I think you can hear me. If you can, I want you to know that I remember you. I do not know what I can offer you here that I could not offer you before. But I am going to figure it out." He set the journal down and returned to the seal matrix, and worked until the candle burned out and the tea was frozen. Chapter 3. The Academy and the Weight of a Name. There is no lonelier place in the world than a room full of people who have decided, without asking, that they already know who you are. The Ninja Academy accepted students at age 7, and Issei arrived on the first day carrying a supply bag that was slightly too heavy for a 7-year-old and containing, in addition to the standard materials, 4 personal notebooks, 2 spare ink brushes, a wrapped set of practice sealing paper, and a folded schematic for a chakra detection array he was in the middle of designing. He had also, in the 2 months since beginning formal chakra exercises with his father, awakened his Sharingan. This was, by Uchiha standards, remarkable. The Sharingan typically manifested in moments of extreme emotional intensity, fear or grief or rage pushing the ocular system past its normal threshold. Issei had awakened his in a quiet moment, sitting alone in the compound garden with his eyes closed, deliberately pressing his awareness into the 3-layer architecture he had constructed around the ember in his chest, holding the seal steady while simultaneously releasing a carefully measured thread of chakra upward through his visual cortex. His eyes had gone red. 2 tomo in each eye, spinning slow and patient as clock hands. He had written in the journal, Sharingan activation confirmed. The eye appears to interface with the remnant architecture in a way I had not predicted. The visual processing enhancement is significant. Pattern recognition and predictive modeling are now automatic functions rather than deliberate ones. However, the more interesting effect is that I can now see the ember directly. It is not an ember. It is a seal. The largest, most complex seal I have ever encountered, and it is inscribed on the interior surface of my own soul. He had stared at that last sentence for a long time before adding, I think I know what I am now. I am going to need more scrolls. The Academy was, in most respects, a disappointment. This was not the fault of the instructors, who were competent and occasionally inspired. It was not the fault of the curriculum, which covered a reasonable breadth of foundational shinobi knowledge. It was simply a structural problem. The Academy was designed to prepare ordinary children for the minimum requirements of genin service, and Issei was not ordinary and did not want minimum requirements. He sat in the back row and listened to everything. He completed every assignment within 30 minutes of receiving it, and spent the remaining time in a small notebook, working on problems that the curriculum would not reach for another 3 years. He was not loud about this. He was not smug. He simply worked, steadily and without interruption, with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting a very long time to have access to this particular library. His classmates found him strange, not dislikable. Strange. There was a difference. He was polite when addressed, precise when asked questions, and capable of something that passed for warmth when the situation called for it. But he had the quality, which only intensified as he grew, of a person who is present in the room but whose real attention is always somewhere slightly behind their eyes, working on a problem no one else can see. The instructors found him unsettling in the specific way that prodigies always unsettle people who are used to being the most capable person in their own classroom. The exception was a girl named Rei. Yuzuki Rei was 11 years old, which made her 4 years Issei's senior, which made her too old to be his classmate under any normal interpretation of academy enrollment policy. She was not a student. She was a newly promoted chunin who had been assigned to the academy as a teaching assistant, while she waited for her next mission posting, a temporary placement that the senior instructor, a tired man named Daichi, clearly regretted within 48 hours. Rei's reputation, which Issei absorbed from ambient classroom gossip within his first week, was as follows: terrifyingly fast, pathologically competitive, possessed of an instructional philosophy that could be summarized as if it hurts you are learning. She had graduated early, advanced to chunin at 10, and was widely expected to make jonin before her 15th birthday if she did not first injure someone important during a training exercise. She found Issei on the 3rd day of the semester. He was in the training yard during the afternoon break, not sparring with the other students but standing alone at the edge of the field with a small piece of sealing paper balanced on his open palm. He had been running a test. He wanted to know whether his Sharingan could track the chakra flow through a seal in real time as it activated, and the answer, based on approximately 60 repetitions, appeared to be yes. Rei appeared at his elbow without any sound at all, which suggested either excellent stealth training or that Issei had been more absorbed than he thought. He looked up. She was looking at the paper on his palm with an expression that he could not immediately classify, something between recognition and suspicion, and a third thing he did not have a word for yet. 3-layer activation, she said. He looked at the paper, then back at her. 2. I have not mastered the junction geometry for 3 yet. She raised an eyebrow. You know what a 3-layer seal is? Theoretically. The literature suggests it is unachievable without causing interference at the junction nodes, but I believe the interference is a calibration problem rather than a theoretical sealing. I have been working on the geometry. There was a pause. You are 7, she said. I am aware. Another pause, longer than the first. Then Rei folded her arms and looked at him with the particular sharp attention of someone recalibrating an assessment mid-calculation. Show me the geometry, she said. He showed her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, You are going to be a problem, and walked away, and Issei filed her under category, interesting, and returned to his test. She came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the second week she had essentially appointed herself his unofficial supervisor, a role she approached with the same aggressive dedication she apparently applied to everything. She reviewed his seal work with an expert eye, corrected his brush technique with blunt precision, and introduced him to 3 advanced texts that were not part of the academy curriculum but that she had brought from the Jonin library with the cheerful authority of someone who had never once been told no by a librarian. She was, Issei decided after careful observation, exactly what he needed. Not because she was smarter than him. She was not, and she knew it, and the knowledge sat in her without apparent resentment, which he respected enormously. But she was faster in her body than anyone he had ever seen, and she had practical experience he could not yet access, and she had a quality of attention, when she was focused on a problem, that matched his own in kind if not in subject matter. He trusted her assessment of his physical training in the same way he trusted his own assessment of seal theory. Because she was right, and being right was the only credential he had ever respected. On the 14th day, during a late afternoon session in the empty training yard, she put him on the ground for the 3rd time in 20 minutes, and he lay there looking at the sky and thinking. You lead with your right shoulder, she said. Every time. I know. I am mapping your response pattern. I needed 12 iterations to be confident. She stared at him from above. You let me knock you down 12 times on purpose. Data has a cost, he said, and sat up, and in his Sharingan, the pattern he had been assembling across those 12 falls finally resolved into something complete and usable. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, sudden and genuine, and it sounded nothing like the composed Chunin who had found him in the training yard 2 weeks ago. It sounded like something real. All right, she said, and held out her hand. Get up. Again. He took her hand. He stood. And when he moved this time, she missed. Chapter 4. The Dragon and the Seal. You cannot forge iron without applying heat. The question is whether the heat destroys what it touches or only changes its shape. The breakthrough that changed everything came 3 months into the academy year, on the night of a thunderstorm that kept the entire compound awake and provided, entirely by accident, precisely the conditions Issei had been trying to reproduce artificially for 11 weeks. He was in his room, at his desk, with the 3-layer seal matrix deployed on the practice board and all 4 chakra channels running at full calibrated output. He had been here before. Many times. The seal would hum, the ember would respond with that brief, controlled flare, and then everything would settle back into equilibrium. The entity within would stir but not wake. He would make notes and try again. Tonight the storm was doing something to the atmospheric chakra saturation, pulling energy into the air in a way he had not accounted for, and when he pressed the 3rd layer of the seal, the input was approximately 40% higher than his calculated baseline. The seal did not just hum. It sang. The sound was below hearing and above it simultaneously, felt in the chest and behind the eyes and in the specific hollow of the wrist where chakra ran closest to the surface. The 3-layer matrix blazed with light he had not expected, crimson and gold in a ratio he had never seen in standard chakra expression, and the ember in his sternum did not flare. It opened, like a door, and from the other side of that door, a voice said, very clearly and with the deliberate precision of someone who had been waiting a very long time to speak, well. Finally, Issei sat perfectly still. The voice resonated in the interior space behind his sternum, not through his ears, not through air. It was direct, immediate, like a thought that was not his own but that lived in the same room as his own thoughts. He said out loud because he was not yet sure of the protocol, hello. A pause. Then the voice said, with something that was unmistakably amusement, you say hello. I have been sleeping inside you for 7 years, waiting for you to build something complicated enough to knock on the door, and you say hello. I was not going to say hello until I had something substantive to offer, Issei replied. I am still working on the substantive part. But the 3-layer seal appears to function as a sufficient activation threshold, which is promising. Another pause. Longer. The quality of the silence from the other side of the door was evaluative in a way he recognized, because he used the same quality himself. I remember you, the voice said finally. Smaller and less amused now. Quieter. I remember you too. Issei looked at the glowing matrix on his desk, then at his own hands in the seal light. I am sorry it took so long. You rebuilt the bridge from scratch using only materials available in this world, the voice said. I was not expecting apologies. I was expecting explanations. You will get both. But the explanation is going to require me to teach you about chakra, fuinjutsu, and the theoretical overlap between sacred energy systems and the human body's chakra network. It will take a while. A sound that might have been a laugh from a creature large enough that laughter moved like a seismic event through enclosed spaces. I have nothing but time, partner. And apparently neither do you. Issei reached for his journal. The entity was, of course, Drag, Welsh dragon, heavenly dragon. One of the two greatest sacred beasts in the system that governs supernatural power in the world Issei had been born into in his previous life. He had died as Issei Hyoudou, possessor of the boosted gear, partner of a dragon so old that the humans who wrote down his legend had been doing so from memory for generations by the time the ink first touched paper. In this world, the boosted gear did not exist as a physical object. There was no gauntlet, no jewel, no crimson armor waiting to manifest from ambient energy. What existed instead was the seal, the enormous, incomprehensibly intricate inscription on the interior surface of his soul that he had first glimpsed with his Sharingan 3 months ago. Drag was not inside the gauntlet. Drag was the seal. Or rather, the seal was the record of Drag, and Drag was the consciousness that inhabited the record, a distinction that he was going to need several months and at least 2 entirely new theoretical frameworks to fully understand. He explained this to Drag over the course of 4 conversations that took place during subsequent storms, because the elevated atmospheric chakra made the door easier to open. Drag listened with the patience of something that measured time in centuries rather than years and offered, occasionally, corrections that implied a level of self-knowledge Issei found both useful and slightly humbling. I am not the seal, Drag said during the 3rd conversation. I am what the seal was built to contain. The distinction matters because what is contained can change what contains it, if the container is flexible enough. And you, partner, are building a very flexible container. Fuinjutsu is an architecture, Issei said. The architecture can be modified. Modified. The word you are looking for is transmuted. Issei looked up from his journal. Say that again. Transmutation. The conversion of one thing into another without loss of essential nature. What you are doing with those seals, layering them, restructuring the junction geometry, building frameworks that standard theory says cannot exist, is not mere fuinjutsu. You are performing alchemical operations on the fundamental structure of your own energy system. You are transmuting chakra into something that does not have a name yet in your world's literature. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Issei wrote a single line in his journal, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone writing something they know they will read again for the rest of their life. He wrote, I am an alchemist. He told Ray the next day. Not everything. He was not going to tell anyone everything for a long time, possibly ever, because everything included a past life and a Welsh dragon and a seal inscribed on the interior surface of his soul and a theoretical framework so far outside current shinobi science that presenting it without extensive documentation would simply result in people worrying about him rather than engaging with the ideas. But he told her enough. He told her that he had discovered an anomalous resonance in his chakra system that appeared to respond to complex seal architecture. He told her that preliminary testing suggested this resonance had properties that existing fuinjutsu theory did not account for. He told her that he was going to pursue this line of inquiry and that she was the only person he knew whose opinion of his work he trusted enough to share it with. She was quiet for longer than usual. They were sitting on the roof of the training hall in the late afternoon, the sky going orange at the edges, and she had her knees pulled up to her chest and her dark eyes on the middle distance. You are telling me this, she said finally, because you need a witness. Yes. Someone who knows what you are actually doing in case it becomes important later. Partly. Also because you have been training me for 3 months and you have not once asked me to stop working on the theoretical problems. That is a form of trust one did not expect and have not forgotten. She looked at him. He looked back with the calm, direct attention that people who did not know him found unnerving and that Ray, by now, had categorized simply as Issei being honest. All right, she said. I am your witness. A beat. Do not do anything that will get you killed before you figure out what you are actually building. I will make every reasonable effort. Issei. I will make every effort. She sighed, which was as close to laughter as she usually got when she was trying to be serious. And on the roof above the training hall, with the sky going dark and the village spreading out below them in lights and sounds and the ordinary busy texture of a place where extraordinary people tried to live ordinary lives, Issei looked at the last entry in his journal and felt, for the first time since his rebirth, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. He was 7 years old. He was the alchemist. And he was only just beginning. Chapter 5. The first transmutation. The difference between a tool and a weapon is intention. The difference between a weapon and a masterwork is understanding. He did not sleep much that winter. The access to DxD, once established, became a resource that Issei treated with the same rigorous systematic approach he applied to everything. He set a schedule. 3 sessions per week, each lasting no more than 2 hours, each beginning with a structured agenda and concluding with documented findings. He did not simply sit in communion with the dragon and wait for inspiration to arrive. He brought questions, and he listened to the answers, and then he tested the answers against physical experimentation the way any responsible researcher tests a hypothesis. DxD found this both admirable and, occasionally, maddening. You are the only human I have ever partnered with, the dragon observed during their 6th session, who approached the relationship as though it were a peer-reviewed academic collaboration. Would you prefer I approached it differently? No. It is efficient. I am simply noting that it is unusual. I will try to be more chaotic in future sessions if you find the structure limiting. The sound that followed was unmistakably a snort. Continue as you are, partner. What is the question tonight? Sacred gear transmutation, Issei said. In my previous life, the boosted gear had a fixed architecture. Doubling ability. Progression toward balance breaker. The power was significant, but the design was essentially static. I want to know if the absence of the physical artifact and the presence of chakra as a medium creates an opportunity to rebuild the architecture from principles rather than inheriting it from precedent. A pause significantly longer than usual. Then DxD said, with a quality in his voice that Issei had not heard before, something between careful and awed, you want to redesign the sacred gear. I want to understand it well enough to have that option. Another pause. No human has ever suggested this to me before, DxD said. In several thousand years of partnership history. Not one. That seems like an oversight. DxD was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that carried the weight of something being decided, let me tell you what I am, at the fundamental level. Not the legend. Not the title. The actual structural reality of what a heavenly dragon is and how we interface with the physical world. This conversation is going to be long. I brought extra paper, Issei said. What DxD told him over the course of the following weeks reorganized Issei's entire theoretical framework the way a strong wind reorganizes leaves, scattering the old arrangement, and revealing the ground beneath. A sacred gear, at its most fundamental level, was a resonance architecture. It was not a physical object. The gauntlet, the jewel, the armor, these were expressions, physical manifestations of an underlying pattern that existed at the intersection of spiritual energy and the raw fabric of possibility. The pattern was the gear. The physical form was simply the way that pattern chose to interface with the human body it inhabited. Chakra, DxD explained with the careful precision of someone who had been waiting decades to articulate this to someone who could understand it, is not the same as sacred energy. But it is not entirely different either. Both are forms of life force structured by intention. Both respond to complex pattern work. The difference is one of frequency. The way 2 musical notes, played on different instruments, are still recognizably the same pitch, even though the tonal quality differs. Issei wrote, chakra and sacred energy are frequency compatible but not identical. Conversion possible via intermediate architecture. Seals are the intermediate architecture. Correct, DxD confirmed. What you have been doing with the 3-layer matrix is building a frequency converter. A device that takes chakra input, passes it through the junction geometry you derived, and produces an output that the resonance architecture of my essence can interface with. You have been doing this intuitively, but now you know it explicitly. If I know it explicitly, I can design it deliberately. Yes. If I can design it deliberately, I can optimize it. Yes. And if I can optimize it, I can begin to reconstruct the gear architecture itself from the ground up, using chakra as the substrate instead of sacred energy, building each function as a discrete seal component that can be modified independently rather than accepting the fixed architecture of the original design. The silence was profound. Then Drake said, and there was something in his voice that Issei recognized after a moment as pride, yes, partner. You can do all of that. And I will help you. He called the first completed component the resonance foundation. It was a 7-layer seal, inscribed not on paper but on his own skin, specifically on the inside of his left forearm, in ink he had modified by adding a trace concentration of his own blood. The blood binding technique was considered advanced even by adult Fuinjutsu practitioners, and Rei had spent an entire afternoon alternating between being impressed and being alarmed. He had talked her through the theoretical basis until she crossed the line from alarmed to only somewhat alarmed and then, eventually, to thoughtfully engaged. She had watched him complete the inscription with the steady hands of someone who had practiced the brushwork 500 times on paper before once attempting it on skin. If you are wrong about the junction geometry, she had said, this will hurt significantly. I have run the calculation 11 times. I am not wrong about the junction geometry. And if the blood binding reacts unexpectedly with your chakra network? Then I will have very useful data about how blood binding reacts unexpectedly with chakra networks. She had given him the look, the specific expression that meant she was not going to argue with him because arguing would not change anything, and she had learned this about him 3 months ago. But she stayed. She sat across the table and watched the entire process from beginning to end, and when he set the brush down, and pressed his palm flat over the completed seal and pushed chakra into the foundation layer, she leaned forward with an attention that matched his own in intensity if not in subject. The seal activated, not with the preliminary hum of his earlier work. This was a sound like the world remembering something it had almost forgotten, a resonance that went down through the floor and up through the crown of his head, and out through every chakra point simultaneously. The Sharingan activated automatically, and through it he could see the seal blazing on his forearm in colors that did not exist in the standard spectrum, crimson layered over gold layered over a third color that had no name yet. And Drake, at the very center of the architecture he had built around the dragon's sleeping presence, opened his eyes. Not literally. There were no eyes to open. But the quality of presence in the interior space changed entirely, the way a room changes when someone walks in who changes every room they walk into. The sleeping consciousness became an awake one, and the awareness that met Issei's own was old and enormous and precise and deeply, deeply satisfied. Hello, partner, Drake said. And this time the voice was not behind a door. It was simply there, resident and clear and permanent, a second voice in the room of his mind that belonged there as naturally as his own. Hello, Issei said. Rei was staring at his arm. At the seal, which was still glowing faintly in the residual light of the activation. At his eyes, which she had seen go red before but which were currently burning with a pattern she had not seen before, the two tomo replaced by something more complex, a wheel within a wheel, each spoke traced in the same crimson gold that ran through the seal. What, she said very carefully, was that? He looked at her. He thought about how to answer. That, he said finally, was the foundation. Everything else is built on top of it. She looked at the seal on his arm for a long moment. Her expression was complex, which was unusual for her. How many layers are there going to be? She asked. He thought about the schematic he had drawn and redrawn across 40 notebooks, the architecture that stretched from the foundation upward through conversion systems and amplification structures and eventually, if the theory held and the years of work ahead of him produced what he believed they would produce, to something that had never existed before in either world. A sacred gear rebuilt in the substrate of an entirely different energy system. A power that was not borrowed from precedent but designed from first principles. He thought about Drake's voice, clear and constant now at the back of his mind, patient and ancient and absolutely certain. Many, he said. Outside the window, the winter had cracked at last, and the first fragile warmth of an early spring was working its way up through the frozen ground of Kanahigakure, tentative and persistent and irreversible. Issei Hyoudou, age 7, Uchiha by name, alchemist by nature, looked at the light on his forearm and began to plan the second layer. Act 2, The Architecture of Becoming. Chapter 6:12. Chapter 6. The Second Layer. Patience is not the absence of urgency. It is the discipline of letting the work set its own pace while you keep yours. Spring became summer and summer became the long amber stretch of autumn, and Issei built the second layer. It took 6 months. He did not consider this excessive. The resonance foundation, the first layer, had taken 5 months to design and 1 afternoon to inscribe, and in the weeks since its completion he had learned more about the structural reality of DxD's essence than he had accumulated in the 7 years of patient waiting that preceded it. The foundation was doing what foundations were supposed to do. It was holding everything else up. But the everything else did not yet exist, and the second layer was where the real theoretical work began. He called the second layer the conversion matrix. Its purpose was translation. The resonance foundation had established a stable interface between his chakra network and DxD's essence, which meant the two systems could now communicate in real time. But communication was not the same as cooperation, and cooperation was not the same as integration. What Issei wanted, eventually, was integration, the complete unification of chakra and draconic energy into a single expression that partook of both without being limited by either. The conversion matrix was the intermediate step, the architecture that would take raw chakra input, parse it through a series of increasingly refined conversion chambers, and produce an output that DxD could directly amplify or modify rather than simply observe. The theoretical work filled 3 notebooks. Ray reviewed them over 3 consecutive evenings, sitting at the small table in the corner of the training hall where she had developed the habit of doing her own administrative work, while Issei worked nearby. She read with the particular quality of attention she gave to everything that mattered, unhurried and precise, occasionally making a small sound that indicated she had found something that interested her, and intended to ask about it later. On the 3rd evening she set the last notebook down and looked across the table. The junction architecture on pages 40 through 43 is wrong, she said. He looked up. The calculation is correct. The calculation is correct, and the architecture is wrong. You have solved the junction problem on paper the same way you solved the 3-layer problem on paper, by deriving an elegant theoretical framework that assumes your chakra output is perfectly stable. It is not. Chakra output fluctuates based on physical state, emotional state, fatigue, temperature, and approximately 20 other variables you are not accounting for in the model. Issei was quiet for a moment. I need to add a stabilization buffer, he said. You need to add a stabilization buffer, she agreed. A pause. Then you are right. I am frequently right. You are simply occasionally too absorbed in the theory to notice. She picked up her own paperwork. Fix the junction architecture. Then show me the inscription plan. He picked up his brush and fixed it. The stabilization buffer added 3 weeks to the design phase and resolved 4 structural problems he had not yet realized were structural problems. When he finally completed the conversion matrix and inscribed it on his right forearm in a session that lasted 4 hours and required 2 breaks for hand cramps, the activation was cleaner than anything he had produced before, smooth and deep and precisely calibrated, like a door opening on well-oiled hinges rather than a door being forced. DxD's presence, which had been constant and clear since the foundation, changed quality the moment the matrix engaged. It deepened. The voice at the back of his mind moved from the register of a thought that was not his own into something more immediate and resonant, the way a conversation conducted through a wall becomes something different once someone opens a window. Better, DxD said simply. Much better, Issei agreed. He was 8 years old. He had 2 layers. He had no idea yet how many there would eventually be, but the architecture was sound and the theory was developing faster than he had projected, and he had, for the first time, a collaborator who understood the problem from both sides. He allowed himself one evening of simple satisfaction before beginning the 3rd layer. The thing about being 8 years old with a mind that operated the way Issei's did was that the academy was simultaneously his most valuable resource and his greatest scheduling constraint. He needed the academy for access. access to the Jonin-level scrolls that occasionally surfaced in the library through the mechanism of older students who checked them out and did not return them on time. Access to the training facilities, specifically the chakra measurement arrays that were available for student use 2 afternoons per week. Access to the informal education that happened in the margins of formal instruction, the conversations between instructors about real missions, the occasional visiting expert who came to lecture on specialist topics, the accumulated institutional knowledge of a village that had been producing extraordinary shinobi for generations. He needed the academy. He simply needed it on his terms rather than its own. His academic performance was, naturally, perfect. He treated the curriculum the way he treated everything that was useful but insufficiently challenging. He completed it at maximum efficiency, and used the remainder of his mental bandwidth for other things. His test scores were uniform and high. His practical demonstrations were clean and technically precise. His instructors had largely settled into a relationship with him that could be described as respectful wariness, the approach of people who suspected that the student understood the subject better than the teacher but who had not yet found a way to confirm this diplomatically. The one exception continued to be Rei. She had been promoted to Jonin 6 weeks after Issei completed the conversion matrix, a development that she had announced by appearing at their afternoon training session with the new vest and an expression of such studied neutrality that he had understood immediately that she was pleased and intended to be professional about it. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you. You are going to run the full circuit twice before we discuss the third layer, because you have been neglecting your taijutsu fundamentals in favor of the inscription work, and it shows." He ran the circuit twice. She was right that his fundamentals had slipped, and the acknowledgement of this was entirely internal and entirely sincere. The physical training was not secondary. He had understood from the beginning that the seal architecture he was building was the theoretical side of the work, but that a body which could not execute under pressure was an architecture built on unstable ground. He ran the circuit twice, and then they sat together in the late afternoon light, and he showed her the schematic for the third layer, and she asked the right questions, and between them the work moved forward in the way it always did when two people who respected each other's intelligence shared a problem. Chapter 7. What the Sharingan Sees. The greatest gift of perception is not that it shows you more. It is that it shows you why more matters. His Sharingan had been 2 tomos since its awakening at age 6. He was 8 when the third tomo appeared, and the circumstances were, by any reasonable standard, embarrassing. He was in the academy sparring yard on a Wednesday afternoon, working through a taijutsu drill with a classmate named Taro who was a full year older, significantly larger, and possessed of the particular confidence of a boy who had never yet encountered a problem that being larger than it had not solved. The drill was a standard one-on-one exercise designed to practice defensive movement. It was not supposed to be a real fight. Taro had a tendency to forget that in the company of opponents who could not immediately retaliate. He had been pushing the boundaries of the drill for 10 minutes, gradually escalating the contact past what the exercise required. And Issei had been letting him do it partly because he was tracking the pattern and partly because he had learned in the previous year that physical confrontation in academy settings was best resolved through the opponent exhausting their aggression against a target that did not respond to it rather than through direct opposition, which tended to produce escalation rather than resolution. But Taro's 14th strike came in at an angle that Issei's current defensive position could not adequately cover, moving faster than the preceding 13 in the way that aggression sometimes surges when it has gone unopposed for too long, and in the fraction of a second before impact Issei made a decision. He did not block. He redirected. It was a technique Rei had been drilling into him for months, a concept she called reading the whole body rather than the striking limb. Instead of meeting the arm, he tracked the shoulder, the hip, the weight distribution, the telltale overcommitment of someone striking harder than their balance could support, and he moved inside the arc of the strike rather than away from it, which put Taro's own momentum to work against him in a way that ended with Taro on the ground and Issei standing over him with the calm expression of someone who has completed a calculation. Taro stared up at him. The yard was very quiet, and in Issei's eyes, the third tomo completed its rotation and clicked into place with the quiet certainty of a lock being set. He felt it the way he imagined you would feel a door in your mind opening outward rather than inward, a sudden expansion of the visual field that was not about what he could see but about the resolution at which he saw it. The world did not become larger. It became more legible. The chakra flowing through Taro's body was visible as a map of intention, every potential movement pre-traced in energy before the muscles made their first decision. The grain of the wood in the practice posts was individually distinct. The afternoon light had texture. He looked at his own hands. Through the 3 tomo Sharingan, the resonance foundation on his left forearm and the conversion matrix on his right were not merely visible as seal ink. They were fully illuminated, every layer of the architecture burning in its own distinct register, the junctions and stabilization buffers and conversion chambers all simultaneously legible in a single field of vision. He could see, for the first time, the complete structural diagram of what he had built, not as a schematic he had drawn on paper but as a living, active system encoded in his own body. He could also see, at the center of the foundation, the seal that was Drag, not the ember. Not the impression of a door. The actual seal, the full dimensionality of it finally visible to eyes capable of reading it, and it was so complex that even with the Sharingan's enhanced pattern recognition he could only take in one region of it at a time, the way you look at a mountain by examining its features rather than trying to see the whole thing at once. Vast, Drag confirmed quietly. I did warn you. You did, Issei said, which Taro and the watching classmates could hear and which resulted in an expression of profound confusion from the former, and an uneasy shuffling from the latter. He helped Taro up. He apologized for the force of the redirect, which was genuine. He walked to the edge of the yard and sat down, and opened his notebook and wrote for 20 minutes without stopping while his 3 tomo Sharingan slowly, gradually, returned to its normal black. He showed Rei the eyes that evening. She looked at them for a long moment, and then she did something she had not done before, which was to sit down rather than immediately identify a training implication and begin scheduling adjustments. 3 tomo, she said? Yes. That is the full Sharingan. At this level, yes. The literature suggests further development is possible but requires conditions I am not currently in a position to pursue. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, the Uchiha who reach the full Sharingan early are the ones who become the clan's legends. Or its cautionary tales. Usually the difference is whether they had someone steady around them. He looked at her. I am noting, she said, meeting his gaze directly, that you have that. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact delivered in the tone she used for things she had decided and did not intend to revisit. He recognized the tone because he used it himself. I know, he said. They sat in the quiet of the training hall with the summer evening doing its slow work outside the windows, and Issei thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone who did not flinch at what they saw, and found that he did not have an entry in the journal for this feeling but that he wanted to remember it precisely. He wrote it in the margins of the day's notes, small and without annotation, steady. The word for what this is. The third layer of the architecture was what he called the amplification chamber, where the conversion matrix translated chakra into a form Drag could interface with. The amplification chamber was the mechanism by which Drag's response could be fed back into Issei's physical capabilities. The boosted gear's foundational function, in its previous form, had been multiplication, a doubling of power at regular intervals. Issei had no intention of replicating this directly. Multiplication was blunt. He was designing something more precise. The amplification chamber worked on the principle of targeted resonance. Rather than doubling all output indiscriminately, it was designed to identify which system most needed enhancement in any given moment: physical strength, speed, chakra output, sensory acuity, or any combination thereof, and direct the amplified energy specifically there. Drag, with his millennia of experience processing energy systems, served as the routing intelligence. Issei, with his Sharingan and his analytical mind, served as the targeting system. Together they were, in theory, more efficient than the original design by a factor Drag found both impressive and faintly insulting to the work of whatever divine craftsman had designed the boosted gear in the first place. You are improving on a divine artifact, Drag observed, during a late-night session while the inscription work dried. I am building something new that serves a similar purpose with greater precision. It is not an improvement on the original because it is not the original. It is a different answer to the same question. The divine craftsman would disagree. Then the divine craftsman should have accounted for the possibility that his artifact might one day be reborn into a chakra-based energy system. Engineering that does not account for environmental variables is incomplete engineering. The sound Drake made this time could only be described as delighted. Issei finished the inscription and allowed himself the small private satisfaction of someone who has completed a difficult thing and knows it. He was 9 years old. He had 3 layers. He was, by any reasonable measure, just beginning. Chapter 8. The kunoichi who reads fire. Some people enter your life like a door swinging open. Others enter like a key turning in a lock you did not know was there. Her name was Uchiha Hana, and she was his cousin, and she had hated him for exactly 3 years before she decided, on a Tuesday in early spring, that she did not. The hatred had been, as most clan internal hatreds are, entirely structural. Hana was 2 years older than Issei, which meant she had grown up in the comfortable position of being the most academically gifted child in their generation of the Uchiha clan, a distinction that had required genuine effort and produced genuine pride. Then Issei had arrived in the academy and read every text she had worked through in 2 years in approximately 4 weeks and spent the remaining curriculum time writing in notebooks that no one was allowed to see, and the clan elders had begun to watch him with the particular quality of attention they reserved for futures that needed monitoring. She had disliked him the way you dislike weather. Not personally. Simply as a force that had rearranged the landscape without asking. The Tuesday in question was a training evaluation day, and Hana had been assigned to observe a junior sparring session as part of her Chunin preparation, which meant she was standing at the edge of the training yard when the session instructor asked Issei to demonstrate a fire jutsu. Standard request. The Uchiha were fire specialists. Every child in the compound had been practicing fire release since before they could properly hold hand signs. Issei performed the jutsu. It was not the standard version, the standard academy demonstration of fire release. Fireball jutsu produced a sphere of flame approximately the size of a training post, and held it for 3 seconds before releasing. What Issei produced was structured differently. The sphere was there, correctly formed, but its surface was layered, the outermost shell burning at a different thermal register than the interior, separated by a boundary that any Fuinjutsu scholar would have recognized immediately as a containment seal, miniaturized and embedded directly into the chakra expression of the technique. The fireball was, in effect, its own seal architecture. It was stable in a way that standard fire jutsu was not, perfectly controlled, capable of being directed with a precision that the raw expression of the element did not permit. The instructor stared. Hana stared. Issei released the technique, noted the evaluation score on his form, and moved to the next exercise. Hana was still standing at the edge of the yard 20 minutes later when the session ended and the other students filed out. Issei was gathering his supply bag when she appeared beside him. That containment structure, she said, without preamble. It was a seal. He looked at her. Yes. You embedded a Fuinjutsu structure into the chakra expression of a ninjutsu technique. Yes. That is not possible. You watched me do it. A pause that had a different quality than his usual pauses with people who were surprised by his capabilities. Most people, when confronted with evidence that a theory they had held was incorrect, cycled through denial before arriving at recalibration. Hana did not cycle. She simply looked at the place where the fireball had been and then back at him, and the expression on her face was not denial. It was the expression of someone making a very fast set of extremely large revisions. How, she said? He considered her for a moment. She had, he noted, eyes that were slightly unusual for an Uchiha, darker than most, with an attentiveness that reminded him of the way Rei looked at things that interested her, which was to say completely. That conversation is long, he said. But I am willing to have it if you are willing to approach it as a theoretical discussion rather than a challenge. She looked at him steadily. I am 10 years old. I do not need to challenge a 9-year-old to feel competent. No. But you needed me to be wrong about the seal, and I was not, and I want to make sure that is resolved before we proceed. The steadiness of her gaze did not waver, which he took as a good sign. It is resolved, she said. Explain the theory. He explained the theory. She asked 17 questions. He answered all of them. By the time they were finished, the training yard was empty and the afternoon had become early evening, and Hana had the quality of expression he had learned to recognize in people who had just been given a new and sufficiently large idea to think with. I want to learn Fuinjutsu, she said. Real Fuinjutsu. Not the surface-level scrolls ceiling they teach at the academy. I can recommend the theoretical texts. The practical application will require more time than I currently have to offer, but I can point you toward the right foundations. She looked at him with the same level directness she had used throughout the conversation. You are 9 years old and you just embedded a Fuinjutsu architecture into active ninjutsu chakra. I am not asking you to teach me. I am asking you to show me the direction. There is a difference. He thought about it. She was right that there was a difference, and the distinction mattered in the same way all precise distinctions mattered. All right, he said. Direction I can provide. She nodded once, with the crisp efficiency of someone concluding a negotiation successfully, and gathered her own bag. At the edge of the yard she paused without turning. For what it is worth, she said, I was wrong about you. You are not what I thought you were. What did you think I was? A brief pause. Arrogant. In the way that people are arrogant when they know they are better than everyone around them and cannot be bothered to pretend otherwise. And now? She turned and looked at him with an expression he could not quite name yet. Now I think you are simply someone who is working on something important, and does not have time for performances. A beat. I can respect that. She left. Issei stood in the empty yard for a moment, and then wrote in the margin of his evaluation form, because the journal was in the bag and the thought would not wait, Uchiha. Observational speed, exceptional. Calibration speed, faster. Note for future reference. He brought Hana to Rei's attention the following week. This was not an introduction so much as a presentation of data, which was how Issei typically handled things that he considered important but that required another person's assessment to fully evaluate. She recalibrated in real time, he said. Most people take at least a day. She took 30 seconds. Rei, who was reviewing mission paperwork and had learned over 2 years to conduct multiple cognitive operations simultaneously when Issei was in the room, glanced up briefly. Uchiha Hana. I know who she is. Her academy scores are second in her year. They were first until this year. Her instructor introduced a Fuinjutsu component to the advanced assessment. She has not had access to adequate theoretical materials, and you are telling me this because you want to give her access. I am telling you this because I trust your assessment of people more than my own, and I want a second opinion before I make a decision that affects the scope of the work. Rei set down her paperwork. This was, in Issei's experience, a reliable indicator that she had decided the conversation required her complete attention. You are considering bringing her in. I am considering it. A pause. Rei looked at him with the steady evaluative quality she brought to things that mattered. I will meet her, she said. Then we will decide. He nodded. This was the correct answer. He had known it was the correct answer before he asked, which was the reason he had asked rather than simply proceeding on his own judgment. Some decisions, he had learned, were better when they were not made alone. Chapter 9. Monsters and Blueprints. A weapon is only as sophisticated as the mind that designed it. The greatest weapons are not built to destroy. They are built to end the need for destruction. The conversation with Drake that Issei would later identify as the pivot point of his entire theoretical development happened on a cold night in October, with frost on the window and 3 half-finished schematics spread across his desk and a cup of tea that had been hot once. He had been working on the 4th layer, which he called the forge, and he had run into a problem that the preceding 3 layers had not prepared him for. The problem was scope. The first 3 layers, foundation, conversion, amplification, were all personal architecture. They were built to integrate Drake's essence with Issei's own physical and chakra systems, to make the two of them into a more coherent unit than the original boosted gear had ever been. This was working. The integration was advancing on schedule, and the results at the current level of completion were already beyond anything he had expected at this stage of the project. But the forge was supposed to be something different. It was supposed to be the layer that extended the architecture outward, that used the converted and amplified draconic energy not for personal enhancement, but for external application. Creation. Construction. The ability to take raw chakra and draconic essence and combine them into physical objects that could not be made any other way. He had been calling this alchemy since Dreg had given him the word, and he meant it in the literal sense. Not metaphor. Not a useful analogy. Actual transmutation of energy into matter and matter into energy, using the seal architecture as the crucible in which the conversion happened. The problem was that he did not yet understand what he was transmuting toward. He said this to Dreg. There was a long pause. Then the dragon said, "What do you want to be able to make?" "I have a list," Issei said, and produced the notebook. The list was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. It began with items that were ambitious but theoretically grounded, seal constructs of unprecedented complexity, chakra storage objects using draconic essence as the medium, weapons with embedded transmutation architectures that could be modified in the field. These were things that existing shinobi science approached but had never achieved because no one had the forge layer to work from. Midway through the list, the scope changed. Sacred gear analysis and modification, Dreg read, with a quality in his voice Issei could not immediately categorize. You want to be able to take a sacred gear and change what it does. I want to understand them well enough to have that option. The gears are resonance architectures, you told me that. If I can read a resonance architecture with the Sharingan and process it through the conversion matrix, I should be able to analyze any gear I encounter and determine whether modification is theoretically possible. And the next item. Weapons capable of affecting beings of divine nature. Gods exist in the world I came from. They exist in this world too, though the mechanism of their existence is different. Chakra science says nothing about divine beings. Sacred gear theory says quite a lot. A weapon built using draconic essence as the active material, processed through a forge architecture, should be capable of affecting beings that chakra alone cannot touch. Dreg was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I have been partnered with humans for several thousand years. I have seen extraordinary things done with the power I carry. But I have never, not once, sat with a 9-year-old human who was calmly planning the engineering basis for divine class weapons as an item on a list. Is there a problem with the theoretical basis? No. The theoretical basis is sound. That is precisely what concerns me. You are concerned that I will succeed. I am concerned, Dreg said carefully, that you will succeed too early. Power of this scope draws attention, partner. In my world of origin, a human capable of modifying sacred gears and producing divine class weapons would immediately become a target for every faction with an interest in the balance of supernatural power. And there are many such factions. This world has its own version of those factions, Issei said. The great nations. The Kage. The Akatsuki, which does not exist yet but whose foundations are already being laid. The divine beings whose influence touches shinobi history in ways the history books do not fully acknowledge. He paused. I know what I am building and I know what it will mean when it is finished. I am not naive about the implications. But the alternative to building it is not building it, and the world in which I do not build it is a world in which I am simply a very talented jonin with an unusual chakra system, and no capacity to affect the events that I can already see coming. Dreg was silent for a moment. Then, what events? Issei looked at the frost on the window and thought about a war he had read about in history books that had not yet been written, a war that would kill tens of thousands of people across multiple nations and leave the world changed in ways it had not recovered from by the time the story he had read ended. Events I am not prepared to describe in detail yet because I do not yet know how much of what I remember applies to this world rather than the world the story came from. But enough. More than enough. Another pause. Then Dreg said, I trust you, partner. I have trusted you since the first session. But I am asking you to tell me, honestly, whether you understand the difference between building these things because the world needs them and building them because you want to know if you can. Issei sat with this question for a long time. Both, he said finally. And I am not going to pretend otherwise. I want to know if I can because I have always wanted to know if I can. And the world needing it is not a retroactive justification for the curiosity. But the curiosity does not make the need less real. The silence that followed was different from the evaluative silences that usually preceded Dreg's responses. It was warmer. Good, the dragon said. Honest answers are the only foundation I build on. Now, let me tell you what I know about divine class materials, and we will begin designing the forge together. Issei uncapped his pen and turned to a fresh page. Chapter 10. The Third Member. A person who chooses to stand beside you when they could stand anywhere else is not a coincidence. They are a decision. Ray met Hana on a Saturday morning in the small courtyard behind the training hall that had, over the past year and a half, become something like their territory by occupation rather than by any official designation. Issei watched from a bench along the wall with his journal open on his knee, and he paid more attention to the meeting than any of the seal work he had been planning to review. Ray's approach to meeting new people was, in general, the same as her approach to evaluating opponents. She watched first and formed no visible conclusions until the watching was finished. She was standing when Hana arrived, arms loose at her sides, with the quality of stillness that people who had watched her in combat would have recognized as the stillness that preceded action. Hana, for her part, walked in with the composed bearing of an Uchiha who had been raised to understand that every entrance was observed and had long since decided to give observers nothing useful. She was wearing her clan training gear, dark and unadorned, and she looked at Ray with the same level attention she had turned on Issei the day she decided to stop disliking him. They looked at each other for a moment. You read fire like a text, Ray said, without preamble. Hana did not show surprise. I read everything like a text. Issei says you recalibrate faster than anyone he has met except me. I did not know I was being evaluated. You were always being evaluated. Everyone is always being evaluated. The only question is whether the person evaluating you is worth listening to. A pause. He is. Hana glanced at Issei briefly, then back at Ray. I know. Then you know that the work he is doing is not academy level, and the people around it need to be people who can keep up and keep quiet. Can you do both? A silence that was not hesitation but consideration. I have been keeping quiet about things I have noticed since I was 8 years old, Hana said. And I have never once fallen behind curriculum I was given adequate materials for. A beat. The question is whether the materials you are referring to are adequate. Ray's expression did not change significantly, but something in the quality of her attention shifted, and Issei, watching from the bench, recognized the shift because he had seen it before. It was the shift that meant she had found what she was looking for. They are, Ray said. Sit down. Hana sat. Issei put down his journal and joined them at the table, and for the first time the three of them occupied the same space in the same configuration, a specific arrangement that Issei would remember in detail for the rest of his life. The practical integration of Hana into the work took 3 months. She was, as advertised, fast. Her theoretical foundation in Fuinjutsu, once properly supplied with materials, advanced at a rate that Issei found genuinely impressive. Not because she matched his pace, because very few things matched his pace, but because she asked the right questions, which was a much rarer quality. Anyone could read. The people worth working with were the ones who read and then immediately found the edge where the reading stopped and the next unanswered question began. Hana found edges. She found them naturally and without prompting and presented them with a precision that reminded him, in its specific quality, of the way Ray identified tactical weaknesses. Different subject matter, same underlying capacity. Her particular area of focus, which she arrived at through her own trajectory and which Issei had not suggested, was what she called bioarchitecture. The seal work you are building is personal, she said one afternoon, with the notebooks spread between them and Ray reviewing training schedules at the end of the table. It is designed for your body and your specific energy system. The forge layer, the external creation applications, those are not personal. They could in theory produce things that other people could carry or use. In theory, Issei agreed. Then the design question for forge-produced objects is how to calibrate them for users whose energy systems are different from yours. A weapon built using draconic transmutation that is designed for your chakra signature will not work correctly in anyone else's hands. He had known this. He had been holding it in the category of problems to be addressed after the forge layer was complete. Your point, he said. My point is that if you are designing the forge with the intent to eventually produce things that serve purposes beyond your own use, you need an adaptive architecture. Not a fixed output calibrated to one signature but a transmutation process that reads the user and adjusts. She paused. That is a biological problem as much as an engineering problem. The body is not separate from the architecture. The body is the architecture's environment. Issei looked at her for a long moment. You have been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since the second week. He turned to a fresh page in the notebook and dated it. Tell me everything you have concluded, she told him. It took 2 hours. At the end of it, Ray had put down the scheduling work entirely and was listening with her full attention, and there was a quality to the silence in the room that all three of them recognized as the quality of something new having entered it. Bioadaptive Forge Architecture, Issei said. Working title, Hana said. It is accurate enough. He looked at the notes he had been taking while she spoke. This changes the fourth layer design significantly. I know. You knew it would when you presented it. She met his gaze with the level composure that was, he had learned, her version of honesty. Yes. He nodded once. It was not acknowledgement of an inconvenience. It was acknowledgement of a contribution, and the distinction was important, and from the slight ease in Hana's expression he understood that she had recognized the distinction too. Then the forge layer gets redesigned, he said. And your name goes on the theoretical foundation. She blinked. Just once, quickly. Then the composure returned, but it was a warmer composure than before. That is not necessary, she said. It is accurate. I do not record inaccurate attributions. He turned back to the notebook. Now. The adaptive calibration mechanism. Where did you start in your thinking? She started. He wrote. Ray watched them both with an expression that was, for her, remarkably soft. Chapter 11. The Forge Ignites. There is a moment in every act of creation when the thing being made stops being an idea and becomes real. That moment cannot be planned for. It can only be survived. He completed the forge layer 2 months before his 11th birthday. The design, revised 4 times following Hana's bioadaptive framework proposal, was the most complex single-layer architecture he had yet produced. The inscription required 3 sessions across 2 days, each session preceded by 2 hours of chakra stabilization exercises and followed by 6 hours of mandated rest, a schedule that Ray had enforced with the quiet implacability she brought to all physical welfare decisions. He had not argued. She was right about the stabilization requirement, and the rest requirement, and approximately everything else she had ever told him about the relationship between the body's limits and the mind's ambitions. The forge was inscribed along his collarbones and upper sternum, a location he had chosen after 6 months of anatomical mapping because it was the convergence point of the 3 preceding seal systems, close to the heart, close to the chakra center that governed creative and generative functions, and located at the physical center of the architecture he had built so that the energy flows from all 4 layers could communicate with minimal transmission loss. When he activated it for the first time, Hana and Ray were both present. He had not asked them to be. They had simply arrived, on the morning of the activation, with the particular quality of presence that meant they had decided this was not something that happened without witnesses. He had noted this without comment and proceeded with the pre-activation protocol, which involved a 30-minute stabilization sequence, a full architecture integrity check using the 3 Tomos Sharingan, and a brief internal consultation with Drake during which they reviewed the activation procedure one final time. Ready, Drake said. Ready, Issei agreed. He pressed chakra into the foundation, felt it translate through the conversion matrix, felt the amplification chamber receive it, and route it toward the forge's input nodes with the precision of a system that had been calibrated over years of iterative refinement. Then the forge engaged. The sensation was unlike anything the preceding 3 layers had produced. The foundation had been a door opening. The conversion matrix had been a window clearing. The amplification chamber had been a current finding its channel. The forge was heat. Not painful heat, not destructive heat, but the specific heat of a crucible at working temperature, the heat of potential at the moment before it becomes actual. He felt it in his chest, in his hands, in the exact locations where the seal ink traced its patterns across his skin, and it was the most alive he had ever felt in either of his lives. Then Drake opened the channel fully, and the draconic energy entered the forge architecture, and the heat became something else entirely. Through the Sharingan he could see the forge blazing, all 4 layers of the architecture alight simultaneously and connected in a single circuit that ran from his sternum down his arms and back up through his chest in a loop of crimson gold that was not chakra and was not sacred energy, but was something new that had not existed until this moment in this body in this room. He held it for 30 seconds. Then he let it go, carefully and completely, and the light faded and the heat receded to a comfortable background warmth, and he sat still for a moment and breathed. Ray said nothing. Hana said nothing. Then Drake said, with something in his voice that Issei had not heard before in 4 years of partnership, something that was the draconic equivalent of moved, "Well done, partner. Well done." The first transmutation was small. He had planned it to be small. Grand opening demonstrations were for performers. He was an engineer. The first test of a new system should be minimal and controllable, and designed to generate clean data rather than impressive results. He took a small piece of raw iron, the kind available from any blacksmith's waste bin, and placed it on the practice board. He activated the forge. He focused through the Sharingan on the iron's material structure, the arrangement of atoms and energy that made it what it was. He asked Drake to process this information through the draconic essence channel. He formed an intention, clear and specific and held without wavering, change the crystalline structure of this iron into something harder. He pressed the intention into the forge and let the architecture do its work. The iron piece sat on the board for approximately 4 seconds. Then it changed color, from the dull gray of common iron to something darker with a faint undertone of crimson, and when he picked it up it was significantly heavier than it should have been for its size and harder than any iron he had ever handled. He set it down and looked at it. Hana leaned forward and examined it without touching. "The density changed," she said. "Yes. You compressed the material structure. I changed the crystalline arrangement using the forge as a directed energy source with draconic essence as the active catalyst. The resulting material is iron in composition but different in structure. I am going to need to test its properties before I know what to call it." She looked at the piece, then at him, with the expression she used when she was arriving at a conclusion she had not quite reached before but that felt, now that it was there, completely inevitable. "You can do this to anything," she said. It was not a question. Anything with a material structure that the Sharingan can read and the forge can process. The complexity of the transmutation scales with the complexity of the source material. Simple materials are within current reach. Complex biological systems would require significantly more developed architecture, but not impossible. "With this system," he said, "I am beginning to believe that nothing is impossible. Only insufficiently engineered." Ray, from her position against the wall, exhaled slowly through her nose, which was as close as she usually got to expressing "oh." "The third Hokage," she said, "is going to hear about this eventually." "I know. Are you prepared for that conversation?" He looked at the piece of transmuted iron sitting on the practice board, dark and dense and new, the first physical object that had ever existed as a product of the architecture he had spent 4 years building. "Not yet," he said. "But I will be." Chapter 12. What the village notices. Power, properly understood, does not announce itself. It simply makes itself impossible to overlook. The third Hokage had, over the course of a very long career, developed a reliable intuition for the specific quality of silence that preceded something extraordinary. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of accumulation, the silence of a thing that has been building in private for a long time, and is approaching the moment when the private becomes visible. He had felt it before significant events, before certain missions, before the emergence of people who would eventually reshape the landscape of the shinobi world. He had learned to pay attention to it. He had been feeling it around the Uchiha boy for approximately 2 years. His name was Uchiha Issei, which was an unusual name for an Uchiha, and which the boy's parents had apparently given him without any particular significance intended, simply a name they had liked. He was now 10 years old and had been in the academy for 3 years, and his record was perfect in the particular way that records were perfect when the person producing them was working well below their actual capacity. Every score was exactly as high as it needed to be and not a point higher, which was a pattern that the third had learned to identify as deliberate control rather than limitation. The reports from instructors were useful but incomplete. They noted his fuinjutsu aptitude, which was described with adjectives that the third staff had needed to escalate through 3 levels of review before anyone was comfortable signing off on them. They noted his 3 tomos Sharingan, awakened at 8, which was young but not unprecedented. They noted a quality of composed self-containment that the instructors found variously admirable, unsettling, and occasionally frustrating depending on the context. What the reports did not note, because they could not measure it, was the seal work. The third had learned about the seal work from a source he trusted more than official reports, which was his own observation. He had made a point of watching the boys' academy demonstrations personally on 3 separate occasions, and on the third occasion he had seen something that required him to sit quietly in his observation room for a long time afterward with his pipe unlit and his hands folded on the desk. A fuinjutsu structure embedded in active ninjutsu chakra. Not layered over it. Not applied to its output. Embedded inside the technique's chakra expression, integrated at the level of the energy itself, as though the seal and the jutsu were not 2 separate things being combined but a single unified expression of intent. He had consulted with Jiraiya, who had consulted with his own research notes, and the response that came back 2 weeks later was brief and contained the phrase "have no theoretical basis for this," and the separate phrase "if this is real I need to see it," which the third took as confirmation that his own assessment was not idiosyncratic. The meeting was arranged through official channels and presented to Issei as a routine assessment interview, because the third was experienced enough to know that presenting it as anything else would produce a different kind of meeting than the one he actually wanted. He wanted an honest conversation. That required not alarming the subject in advance. Issei arrived precisely on time, which was not surprising. He sat in the offered chair with the composed attention that the third had observed from the gallery, and he looked at the Hokage with the direct, undemonstrative gaze of someone who had decided before entering the room that they had nothing to hide and intended to behave accordingly. The third found himself, unexpectedly, charmed. Not by performance, because there was no performance. Simply by the quality of the presence across the desk, which was more dense with thought than any 10-year-old presence had any business being. "I have reviewed your academy record," the third said. "It is excellent. Thank you, Hokage-sama. It is also," the third continued, in the mild tone he had found most effective for conversations where he wanted honesty rather than defensiveness, "exactly as good as you needed it to be and not appreciably better. Which suggests that the work you are actually engaged in is happening elsewhere." A pause. Not a flustered pause. An assessing one. "Yes," Issei said. "I would like to know about it." Another pause. Longer. "How much would you like to know?" Issei asked. The third looked at him with the attention he gave to questions that were more precise than they appeared. Because it was a precise question. Not evasion. An actual request for parameters, because the answer would be calibrated to the scope of the question. "Everything," the third said. "Or as much of everything as you are prepared to share with me today." A third pause. Then Issei reached into his supply bag and placed 3 notebooks on the desk. "Start with the second one," he said. "The first is preliminary theory and the notation system I developed in year 1 which I have since revised. The second is where the architecture becomes legible." The third opened the second notebook. He read for 45 minutes without speaking. When he looked up, Issei was sitting in exactly the same position he had been in when he arrived, patient and attentive, the way a person is patient when they have learned that waiting for someone to finish understanding something is simply the cost of having something worth understanding. "This is a 3-layer seal architecture," the third said. "4 as of 2 months ago. The third notebook covers the forge layer." The third looked at the third notebook. He did not open it yet. "You built this alone?" "No. Jonin Yuzuki Rei identified a critical stability flaw in the conversion matrix design that I had not caught. She has been my training partner, and an essential collaborative resource for 3 years. Uchiha Hana proposed the bio-adaptive framework that changed the forge design significantly. The theoretical foundations are mine, but the architecture is better than I could have made it without them." The third was quiet for a moment. "You are 10 years old." "Yes. This work," the third said carefully, tapping the open notebook, "represents the most significant theoretical advancement in fuinjutsu I have seen in 30 years of reviewing such things." He watched the boy's face for pride. He did not find it. What he found instead was something he identified, after a moment, as relief. Not surprise. Not gratification. Relief. I needed someone with appropriate authority to know it exists, Issei said. In case something happens to me before it is finished. The third sat back in his chair. You came here to register the existence of the work. I came here because you have been watching me for 2 years and I did not want the conversation to happen on your terms rather than mine. But yes. Partly to register. The work needs to exist in a record that does not depend on my continued presence. A long silence. How old do you think you were when you began this? The third asked. The theoretical foundations were established at 5. The first practical layer was completed at 7. You began building this at 5. I began understanding what I was building at 9. Before that I was working on instinct and derivation. A pause. I am still working on instinct. The instinct has simply become more informed. The third looked at the notebooks and thought about the silence he had been feeling for 2 years, the quality of accumulation, the sense of something extraordinary approaching the point where private became visible. He opened the third notebook. Show me, he said, how the forge layer works. Issei leaned forward, and for the next 2 hours, in the office of the third Hokage of Konohagakure on a quiet autumn afternoon with the village going about its ordinary extraordinary business below the window, a 10-year-old boy explained to the most powerful man in the land of fire exactly what he was building and why, and the most powerful man in the land of fire listened with the complete and focused attention of someone who understood, down to the foundation of his long experience, that he was in the presence of something that would change the world. The only question was how. Act 3, The Weight of the World. Chapters 13-20. Chapter 13, Graduation. The moment you step out of the classroom is not the moment your education ends. It is the moment your education becomes consequential. He graduated at 11. This was not early by the standard of prodigies in Konohagakure's history, but it was early enough to be noted, and the graduation examination itself produced a moment that the academy instructors would discuss in quiet corners for years afterward. Not because of what Issei did during the written and physical assessments, which were perfect and unremarkable in the way that perfect things are when they are entirely expected, but because of the practical demonstration. The standard graduation practical required a student to perform 3 jutsu, a clone technique, a transformation, and 1 technique of the student's choice from the academy curriculum. Simple, designed to confirm basic competency rather than measure ceiling. Issei performed the clone technique and the transformation with the clean precision that had characterized all his academy work. Then, for the technique of his choice, he stood in the center of the examination hall and produced something that had no name in the curriculum because it had not existed when the curriculum was written. He held out his left hand, palm upward. He activated the forge at the lowest possible output level, a single thread of draconic transmuted chakra tracing from the seal on his sternum down his arm to his open palm. Then he reached into the supply pouch at his hip, took out a small piece of ordinary stone, and placed it on his palm. The stone dissolved. Not crumbled. Not broke. Dissolved, its material structure read and processed by the forge, the information absorbed into the architecture and redistributed. In its place, in the space of approximately 4 seconds, a single small object condensed from apparently nothing, a seal tag, but not a standard one. The paper was different, denser and with a faint crystalline sheen. The ink was different, applied not by brush but laid down as part of the transmutation process itself, each stroke of the inscription placed with more precision than any human hand could achieve. It was a Fuinjutsu construct, made from raw material using nothing but his own architecture and intention. He set it gently on the examination table. The senior examiner, a veteran jonin named Koharu who had seen extraordinary things in 30 years of service, looked at the tag. Then at Issei. Then at the tag again. What does it do? She asked. It is a 2-layer detection seal with a passive chakra signature database and an active alert function. If someone whose chakra signature has been recorded in the database passes within 20 meters, it sends a pulse to a paired receiving seal. A pause. It is a prototype. The detection range can be expanded with a larger material base for the transmutation. Kohara looked at him for a long moment. Pass, she said, which was technically adequate and in practice the most extraordinary understatement of her career. Team assignments were announced 3 days after graduation. Issei had known, since his conversation with the third 6 months prior, that his assignment would not follow the standard pattern. The third had been clear about this. In the measured way he was clear about things that required careful framing. The work Issei was doing was too significant to be managed within the standard mission rotation structure without explicit acknowledgement of what it was. There were people in the village who needed to know. There were accommodations that needed to be made. This would happen, but it would happen through proper channels and on a considered schedule. What the third had not told him, because the third had a particular fondness for allowing the people he was developing to encounter certain things firsthand, was the composition of his team. His Jonin instructor was Rei. He had known this was possible. He had considered it probable enough to include in his planning projections. But knowing something is probable and arriving at the moment when it becomes real are different experiences. And when Rei appeared at the team meeting point with her Jonin vest and the particular quality of controlled satisfaction she allowed herself, when things had been arranged exactly as she intended, Issei found that he had very little to say and a great deal to feel. You knew, he said. I requested the assignment 8 months ago. The third approved it 4 months ago. She looked at him with the direct composure that was, he had learned over 4 years, her version of warmth. I was not going to let you go out there under someone who did not know what you were doing. He thought about several responses and discarded all of them in favor of the true one. Thank you, he said. She nodded once, precisely, and moved to the other 2 members of their newly formed team. They were not who he had expected. The first was a girl named Tsubaki, 12 years old, from a small civilian family in the Eastern District, which was unusual for a Konoha team that included an Uchiha and a Jonin of Rei's caliber. She was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have developed stillness as a practice rather than a default, and she had the most acute sensory chakra Issei had ever measured in a peer. A sensitivity to environmental energy that operated like a living radar system with a radius that, by his preliminary estimate, extended approximately 300 meters in open terrain. She introduced herself with a short bow and a single sentence. I read the air. He found this precise and appreciated it. The second was a boy named Katsu, also 12, from the Nara clan, which meant he was significantly smarter than he appeared and had long since perfected the art of appearing less interested than he actually was. He had the particular quality of slowness that Nara clan members cultivated, not laziness but economy, the refusal to expend effort where effort was not required, combined with the capability, when something genuinely engaged him, to operate at a speed that the apparent slowness made startling. You are the seal prodigy, Katsu said, looking at Issei with the evaluative gaze of someone conducting a rapid assessment. I read the incident report from your graduation practical. The Hokage's office circulated it to clan heads. Issei filed this information. The Hokage's office circulated it to clan heads. Which means someone with appropriate authority decided your graduation practical was significant enough to formally document and distribute. A pause. I am interested in what you are actually building. I am also aware that you will not tell me yet. I am noting for the record that I am patient. Issei looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote in the margin of the team briefing document, K. Nara. Patience as strategy. Does not confuse information gathering with urgency. Note for future reference. Rei, observing all of this, said, now that we have established that everyone in this team is paying more attention than they are displaying, shall we begin? They began. Chapter 14. First mission, first measure. The distance between knowing what you can do and doing it in the world is not a distance of skill. It is a distance of commitment. The first 3 months of Team Rei's active service were, by official mission record, unremarkable. D-rank assignments. Escort work within the village. Infrastructure maintenance. The standard graduation year diet of tasks designed to build team cohesion and confirm that newly minted genin could operate together under mild pressure without serious incident. Issei treated these missions the way he treated all exercises that were below his current capacity. He completed them to the highest possible standard and used the remaining bandwidth for other things. In this case, the other things included detailed observational profiling of both teammates, continued work on the fifth layer of his seal architecture, and the development of a detection seal network for the team's operational area that he deployed covertly across 4 missions, and which Ray discovered on the 5th mission, examined without comment for approximately 3 minutes, and then formally incorporated into the team's standard operating protocol. He had known she would do this. He had designed the network to her operational standards. Tsubaki, he was learning, was extraordinary in ways that went beyond her sensory range. She processed environmental information with the analytical depth of someone who had been trained to do so, but the training had been entirely self-directed. She had, it emerged over several conversations during mission downtime, spent her childhood in the Eastern District developing her sensitivity because it was the only thing she had found that she was genuinely better at than anyone around her, and she had treated it with the seriousness of someone who understood that being better at something was only valuable if you understood why and how. She was 12 years old and she had been running personal training protocols for her sensory ability since she was 8. Issei found this deeply recognizable and said so. She looked at him with the quiet directness he was coming to understand was simply how she engaged with things that mattered. You started at 5, she said. Not a question. She had read something in his bearing that told her. The theoretical work, yes. The practical application came later. How much later? 2 years. She nodded slowly. I started at 8, but the practical and theoretical were always the same thing for me. I could not separate them. The sensory ability just was what it was and I worked with it. The integrated approach is sometimes faster, he said. Fewer transfer losses between conception and execution. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read yet. You think in systems? Always. I think in environments. Everything is always in relation to everything else around it. A pause. We are probably going to be useful to each other. I had reached the same conclusion, he said. From 3 meters away, where Katsu had been apparently napping against a tree root during this entire exchange, a quiet voice said, same. Neither of them had realized he was listening. They looked at him. He did not open his eyes. Katsu, Ray said from the other side of the campfire. If you are awake enough to eavesdrop, you are awake enough to take the second watch rotation. Arguable, Katsu said, but sat up. The C rank request came in during their 4th month, which was faster than standard genin progression but not unusual given that their team's performance metrics had been uniformly high, and Ray was not the kind of jonin who recommended her team for advancement unless she was certain they were ready. The mission was straightforward in its briefing and less straightforward in its execution, as C ranks often were. An escort assignment to a merchant convoy making the Eastern Pass, 3 days out and 3 days back, with a known bandit presence in the mountain section that had been reported but not yet addressed by Hunter Neen. Ray briefed them the night before departure with the precision she brought to everything tactical. The bandit group is approximately 12 individuals. Mostly former shinobi, low to mid-shunin level, operating without coordination but with enough combat experience to be dangerous to civilians and to genin teams that underestimate them. She looked around the table at all 3 of them. We will not underestimate them. We will also not seek engagement if disengagement is available. Mission objective is the convoy's safe arrival, not the bandit group's elimination. If engagement is unavoidable? Katsu asked. Tsubaki gives us early warning. I manage the primary threat vector. Issei controls the field. You think 10 seconds ahead of everyone. She said it as simply as a list of weather conditions. Not instructions. Established facts about what each of them did. Issei noted that she had said he controlled the field rather than that he handled support or backup, which were the terms typically applied to the Fuinjutsu specialist in a combat team configuration. She had used the term she meant, which was exactly what he would have chosen. He spent the evening preparing 4 trap seal clusters and a perimeter warning network that could be deployed in under 90 seconds. The engagement happened on the 2nd day, in the mountain section, exactly where the briefing had indicated. Tsubaki identified the advanced scout 400 meters before the ambush point, which gave them 6 minutes to prepare. 6 minutes was, in Issei's operational framework, a generous allocation. He deployed the perimeter network. He placed 2 trap clusters at the ambush point's flanks. He positioned a 3rd cluster at the only viable withdrawal route, inactive, available if needed. Then he stood at the center of the convoy's defensive perimeter and waited. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. Ray handled the 3 former shinobi fighters with the efficient economy of someone well above their weight class. The trap clusters handled 4 others. Tsubaki's environmental reading neutralized a flanking attempt before it developed by simply telling Ray, in a conversational tone, that 3 individuals were moving through the cedar grove at 200 meters on the left bearing and would arrive in 4 minutes. Katsu had positioned the convoy drivers behind a natural rock formation before the ambush triggered. Every civilian was undamaged. The bandits who were still mobile withdrew. 9 minutes. 0 casualties. Ray looked at the field afterward with an expression that was satisfied in the specific way she was satisfied when a thing had gone as well as she had expected it to go. Good, she said. 1 word. Delivered with the weight of a formal commendation. Issei collected his seal clusters and replaced the expended components with spares from his kit, and thought about the field mechanics and what he would adjust for the next engagement, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a system that had worked exactly as designed. Chapter 15. The 5th layer. Every tool has a limit. The purpose of understanding that limit is not to accept it. It is to engineer past it. The 5th layer was the one he had been afraid of. Not afraid in the sense of fear. Afraid in the sense of respect for something whose scope he had not yet fully measured, a problem whose edges extended beyond his current sight. He had been approaching it for 2 years, circling its perimeter, taking measurements from a careful distance, assembling the theoretical framework piece by piece the way you assemble a scaffold before you can begin work on the building itself. He called the 5th layer the integration weave. The first 4 layers had each addressed a specific function: foundation, established connection, conversion translated between energy systems, amplification routed and enhanced output, forge enabled external transmutation. They were discrete components. Clean separations between functions with defined interfaces at the junctions. This architecture had been deliberate, because designing complex systems with discrete components made them testable, modifiable, and easier to troubleshoot. But the discrete architecture had a ceiling. The ceiling was this: a system of separate components, however well calibrated, still operated sequentially. Energy moved through foundation to conversion to amplification to forge in a defined order. The order could be optimized. The transfer losses at each junction could be minimized. But the sequential nature meant that certain operations, the ones that required all 4 functions simultaneously rather than in series, were unavailable to the current architecture. The integration weave was the layer that made all 4 functions simultaneous. It was not, Drake had explained during the design phase, a 5th separate system. It was a meta-layer, an architectural framework that wrapped around the existing 4 and established direct communication channels between all of them, so that foundation, conversion, amplification, and forge were no longer 4 rooms in a building connected by corridors but 4 processes happening in the same space at the same time, each aware of the others, each able to borrow from and contribute to the others in real time. The theoretical design had taken 8 months. The reason it had taken 8 months was that the integration weave, unlike the preceding layers, could not be tested in stages. You could not partially integrate. The architecture either worked as a complete system or it did not work at all, and the only way to know which was to inscribe the entire thing and activate it, which meant that if he had made an error anywhere in 8 months of design work, he would discover that error at the moment of maximum commitment. He had checked the design 37 times. He had asked Drake to check it from the inside, from the perspective of the entity who would be operating through the integrated architecture, and Drake had done so with the methodical attention of someone who understood that getting this wrong had costs neither of them wanted to pay. He had shown the design to Hana, who had spent a week on it, and returned it with 7 annotations, 5 of which identified real refinement opportunities and 2 of which identified issues that would have caused cascade failures at the junction interfaces. He had fixed the cascade vulnerabilities and incorporated 4 of the 5 refinements, and explained at length to Hana why the 5th refinement, while elegant, would introduce a complexity overhead that degraded the real-time performance benefit he was optimizing for. She had disagreed with his reasoning for 3 days and then conceded with the specific quality of concession she gave when she had genuinely been persuaded rather than simply run out of counterarguments. He had checked the design 2 more times after that. Then he had waited for the right night, and the right night had come in the 3rd month of his first active service year, on an evening when the village was quiet and his chakra reserves were full, and Ray was sitting in the corner of the room reading mission reports with the particular quality of presence that meant she was available if needed and intended to remain so. He had not asked her to stay. She had simply not left. The integration weave inscription took 6 hours. It covered the full expanse of his upper back and the backs of both shoulders, the largest single inscription surface he had yet used, chosen because the integration weave's function as a meta layer required it to be physically positioned so that all 4 existing layers were within its field. The ink was the blood-bound formulation he had been using since the Resonance Foundation, modified with a trace mineral compound that Hana had developed over the previous year as part of her bioadaptive framework research, which improved the seal's responsiveness to the user's physiological state. He worked with the methodical focus that 6 hours of sustained precision required, taking 2 breaks at planned intervals to allow his hand to recover and his chakra reserves to stabilize. Ray did not speak during the inscription. She occasionally refilled his tea without being asked, which he understood was her version of sustained attention. At the end of the 6th hour he set down the brush. He sat still for 5 minutes, running the architecture through the Sharingan one final time, checking every junction, every transfer node, every communication channel between the 4 existing layers and the new meta layer that was supposed to bind them into a unified whole. It was correct. All of it. Every junction clean, every node properly calibrated, every channel open and unobstructed. He looked at Ray. Ready, he said. She set down the mission reports. She did not say anything. But she looked at him with the direct, steady attention she brought to things that mattered, and that was enough. He activated the foundation. Felt it engage the conversion matrix. Felt the amplification chamber receive the converted energy. Felt the forge accept the amplified input. And then, for the first time, he activated the integration weave. The meta layer engaged all 4 simultaneously. The sensation was not like heat this time. It was not like a door opening or a current finding its channel. It was like every separate thing he had built over 4 years of work suddenly recognizing that they were all parts of the same thing, and the recognition producing a resonance that moved through every layer simultaneously. A coherence he had not known was missing until it arrived and made the preceding architecture feel like individual instruments that had been playing separately and were now, for the first time, playing together. Drake said nothing. He did not need to. His presence in the integrated architecture was different from everything that had preceded it, not louder but more complete, as though every aspect of his ancient consciousness was finally, fully present rather than channeled through the narrow interface of the preceding 4 layers. The integration we've held. Issei sat in the coherence of it for a long time, feeling what it meant to be the person he had been building towards since the day he had pressed a 7-layer seal into his left forearm at age 7 and felt the ember stir in response. Then he looked at his hands and he thought about the forge and he thought about what the forge could now do when it had the full, integrated, simultaneous support of every layer in the architecture, and a very specific and entirely new kind of excitement moved through him, clean and precise and absolute. Ray, he said. Yes. I need a material testing protocol. Starting tomorrow. I will draft it tonight, she said, and picked up the mission reports again. Chapter 16. What the Forge Makes. A craftsman is defined not by what they are capable of making but by what they choose to make and for whom. The material testing took 3 months and produced results that Hana described, in her characteristically precise way, as a paradigm problem. The issue, she said, on the evening of the 11th testing session, with the results spread across the table between the 3 of them, is that your transmutation outputs do not fit any existing material category. We keep trying to describe what the forge produces using the vocabulary of known materials, and the vocabulary keeps failing. Because they are not known materials, Issei said. Correct. Which means we need new vocabulary. We need new vocabulary and a new classification system, he agreed, and we need to develop both before we can begin the weapons work. Ray, who had been listening from her usual position at the end of the table, said, "Tell me what the testing has established." Issei laid it out. The forge, operating through the integrated 5-layer architecture, was capable of transmuting raw materials into what he had begun calling alchemical composites. The composite properties depended on three variables: the source material's base composition, the forge's processing parameters, and the proportion of draconic essence used as the active catalyst. By varying these three inputs, he could produce materials with specific, design properties rather than having to accept whatever properties the base material offered. The hardness ceiling of the materials he could currently produce significantly exceeded anything in the known metallurgical literature. More significantly, the alchemical composites retained a trace draconic resonance from the transmutation process, a residual quality that made them sensitive to chakra in ways that ordinary materials were not. A blade made from alchemical composite would respond to chakra flow the way a seal responded to chakra flow. It could be directed, modified. Its properties could be adjusted in the field by someone with the right architecture. Ray looked at him steadily. Adjusted how? At current development level, hardness and edge retention can be modulated through direct chakra input by the wielder. At projected development level, once I have worked out the bioadaptive calibration protocol that Hana proposed, a weapon made from alchemical composite could be tuned to its wielder's specific chakra signature and remain inert in any other person's hands. A weapon that only works for one person. A weapon that works best for one person and can be designed to work exclusively for one person if that is the operational requirement. Ray was quiet for a moment. And the divine class application you mentioned to the third. He had told her about the Hokage meeting in full. She had not been surprised, and she had not been pleased exactly, but she had been satisfied in the way she was satisfied when a thing she had been prepared for finally arrived. That requires a higher draconic essence concentration in the transmutation than anything I have produced so far. The current architecture can approach it but cannot reach it. I need to develop the sixth layer before the composite quality crosses the threshold for divine class effect. How far away is the sixth layer? Design phase is approximately 4 months from completion. Inscription and testing will require additional time, so the divine class work is at minimum a year away. Conservatively, yes. She nodded once. This was the response of someone filing a timeline rather than expressing a judgment. In the meantime, she said, what can the current forged produce that is worth making? He looked at the testing results spread across the table. Detection arrays with a range and sensitivity that nothing in current Konoha inventory approaches. Sealing constructs that are physically indestructible under conditions that would destroy standard seal paper. Bladed weapons with edge retention and hardness properties that substantially exceed standard shinobi tools. And, he paused, a prototype of something that does not have a name yet. An object that functions as a persistent seal array and a communication device simultaneously, calibrated to a specific user's chakra signature, that can transmit seal-encoded information across distances that standard messenger techniques cannot reach. Hana looked up from the testing documents. You have designed that already. I designed it 6 months ago. I have been waiting until the integration weave was operational before attempting production, because the production requires all 5 layers working simultaneously. Show me the design, she said. He showed her. She read it in silence for 20 minutes. Then she said, with the particular qualities she had when something had exceeded her already high expectations, "This is remarkable." "It is a prototype," he said. "The production quality will be inconsistent until I have more practice with the forge at full integration output. But the architecture is sound." "Of course it is." She looked up at him. "Make 3. 1 for each of us." He looked at her for a moment. Then at Ray. Ray's expression had the quality of someone who had been waiting for this specific conclusion, and was satisfied to see it arrived at by the right people without prompting. 3, he said. "Yes." Chapter 17. The Girl Who Burned Quietly. Some people carry their fire on the surface where everyone can see it. The ones you need to watch are the ones who carry it deep. The mission to the border village was a B rank, which was their first, and Ray had accepted it with the quiet confidence of someone who had been waiting until she was certain her team was ready and had now determined that they were. The assignment was straightforward in category and complex in execution. A small village on the western border had been experiencing incursions from a group operating out of the no-man's land between Fire Country and Wind Country. The group was not affiliated with any known organization. They were, according to the mission briefing, organized and well-equipped in a way that suggested former military training without suggesting current military backing. The complexity was this: the village had requested assistance but not intervention. They wanted the incursion stopped. They did not want an occupying Konoha force, and they had been explicit about this in terms that the Mission Assignment Office had chosen to summarize diplomatically as culturally independent. They want help, Katsu translated, in the flat analytical tone he used for political problems, without the help being visible afterward. They want the problem to stop without anyone being able to say that they stopped it with Konoha assistance. Correct, Ray said. Which means we operate quietly. No Konoha identification beyond what mission protocol requires. No long-term presence. We assess, we address, we leave. The incursion group, Tsubaki said, with the quality she had when she was asking a question she already suspected the answer to. How does their equipment qualify as well-equipped? The briefing does not specify. The briefing is incomplete on that point because the information is second-hand. We will know more when we arrive and you read the area. Tsubaki nodded. She was already, Issei noted, in the mode she entered when she was preparing her sensory network for deployment, a state of calm attentiveness that was visibly different from her resting state if you knew what to look for. He had learned what to look for in their first month of service. They arrived at the border village late on the second day and were met by the village headman, a weathered woman in her 60s named Kishi, who looked at their team with the frank assessment of someone who had spent her life evaluating people quickly and accurately. Her gaze settled on Issei for a moment longer than the others. Not on his face. On his forearms. He noted this without showing that he had. Tsubaki's assessment of the area came in the first night. There are 12 individuals in the no man's land to the west, she said, with the calm precision she always brought to sensory reports. Base camp approximately 4 kilometers out. The chakra signatures are unusual. They are not uniform in the way that trained military units are uniform. Each one has a distinct signature quality, which suggests diverse origins rather than single school training. Former rogue Nin, Katsu said, not looking up from the map he was annotating. Collected rather than recruited. Different backgrounds, unified by whoever is running the group. There is one more thing, Tsubaki said. Ray looked at her. There is a 13th presence. Separate from the base camp. Approximately 1 kilometer further west. The signature is different from the others. Much stronger. And it does not feel like a shinobi. The word feel was not imprecision. Issei had learned over 4 months of working with Tsubaki that her sensory language was always exact, and that when she said feel rather than measure, she was describing a quality of energy that her sensors detected but that did not translate neatly into the standard vocabulary. Different how, he said. She looked at him, and for a moment he saw the thing in her eyes that appeared when she was searching for words to describe something her ability perceived and the vocabulary around her did not adequately cover. The others, she said slowly, are shinobi. Their energy is chakra, organized and trained. This one is something else. The energy has a different base quality. It is older. It was not learned. It was born into whatever is carrying it. The silence in the room had a particular quality. Issei was already running calculations. Not a shinobi, he said. Not a shinobi. A different category of being entirely. Yes. Ray looked at him. He knew what she was asking before she said it. I need to see it, he said. Before we plan the intervention, I need to know what that presence actually is. Ray considered for approximately 4 seconds, which was a long consideration by her standards. We go at dawn, she said. Together. No engagement without full team consensus. The presence, when they found it, was a girl. She appeared to be approximately their age, which was immediately and obviously misleading in ways that Issei's Sharingan confirmed within the first 5 seconds of visual contact. The energy Tsubaki had sensed was not chakra and was not organized and was not trained. It was elemental. Born into the body the way fire is born into certain materials, a fundamental property rather than an acquired skill. She was sitting at the edge of a stream with her knees pulled up and her hands around them, and she was watching the water with the stillness of something that had been waiting in this place for a long time and had run out of impatience. Her hair was dark and her eyes, when she looked up at their approach, were the color of banked coals, dark amber with a depth to them that was the visual equivalent of what Tsubaki had tried to describe the previous night. Issei stopped walking. Through the Sharingan he could see her energy field clearly. It was unlike anything he had read before in this world. The closest analog in his experience was the resonance architecture of Drake's essence, the quality of something ancient expressed in a form that was currently small but was not, in any fundamental sense, small at all. She was looking at his arms, specifically at the resonance foundation on his left forearm, which had the property of being faintly visible to any entity capable of perceiving energy structures at the level she apparently could. "You have a dragon in you," she said. Her voice was low and even and carried the particular quality of someone stating an observation rather than making an accusation. "Yes," he said. "An old one. Very." A pause. Then she said, and the quality of the question was not confrontational but genuinely curious. "What is it doing in there?" "Helping me work," Issei said. "What are you doing out here?" She looked at the stream. "I was with the group to the east." "I am no longer with the group to the east." "Why?" A pause with weight in it. "Because they wanted to use what I am," she said, "for things that what I am does not want to be used for." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about precision and honesty, and the cost of improperly released information, and then he thought about Ray telling him years ago that the people around this work needed to be people who could keep up and keep quiet. He looked back at Ray. Ray was watching the girl with the steady evaluative attention she gave to things she had not yet decided about. Then she looked at Issei with the look that meant she was waiting for his read. He said carefully and honestly, "I think she is the most important thing we have encountered since this team formed." Ray was quiet for 3 seconds. "What is your name?" she said to the girl. The girl looked up from the stream. The banked coal eyes moved from Ray to Tsubaki to Katsu to Issei and came to rest somewhere between an assessment and a decision. "Emika," she said. Chapter 18. The Nature of Old Fire. To understand what something is, you must first stop trying to fit it into the shape of what you already know. Emika was not a shinobi. She was not a civilian. She was not, by any classification system that Konoha's extensive taxonomy of extraordinary individuals had yet produced, something that had a name. She was, as best Issei could determine over 3 days of careful observation and structured conversation, something he had last encountered in a different life. In a world where such things had names and histories and organized factions to speak for their interests. In this world she appeared to exist entirely without context, which she treated with the equanimity of someone who had long since stopped expecting the world to have prepared a place for her. He worked through the analysis methodically. Her energy was not chakra. It did not flow through the coil and path system that chakra occupied in the human body. It was diffuse, present throughout her body simultaneously rather than concentrated in specific nodes, and it had the property of generating rather than storing, of producing rather than channeling. This was not an energy system that could be trained in the way chakra could be trained. It was a constitution, an intrinsic quality of her physical being at the cellular level. He thought about this for a long time and then said to Drake, during an internal consultation on the second night, "She is not human. Or she is human and something else simultaneously." Drake was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are beings in my world of origin whose nature is exactly what you are describing. A divine heritage expressed in human form. The proportion varies. Sometimes the divine nature is so diluted as to be functionally undetectable. In rarer cases it is strong enough to be the dominant quality. She is the second kind." "Yes," Drake said. "And you are wondering whether the forge can read her architecture." He had been wondering this since the first moment the Sharingan had shown him her energy field. He had not acted on the wondering because reading a person's fundamental nature without their knowledge or consent was a violation he was not willing to commit regardless of the potential research value. "I will ask her," he said. "You are going to ask a girl you have known for 2 days whether you can perform an alchemical analysis of her soul," Drake said, with the quality he used when he found something both admirable and faintly amusing. "I am going to explain what I can see and why I would like to understand it better and ask whether she is willing to cooperate. She can say no. If she says no, I will respect that and adjust my approach." A pause. Then, "You know what I find most extraordinary about you, partner? It is not the architecture. It is not the Sharingan. It is that you have never once, in 4 years of building something unprecedented, confused your right to build it with a right to use it however you please. He thought about this. Then he went to find Emika. She was, as had become her habit in the 3 days since the team had effectively adopted her by the mechanism of Rei deciding that leaving her alone in the no-man's land was not something she was willing to do, sitting slightly apart from the team camp in a way that was not antisocial but was attentive. Watching the trees with the particular quality of environmental awareness that Issei had learned to recognize as someone whose relationship with the natural world was immediate rather than observational. He sat down near her. She did not look at him, but the quality of her stillness changed slightly, an acknowledgement. He explained what he could see with the Sharingan. He explained it carefully and completely, without simplification, because he had determined over 2 days of conversation that Emika was someone to whom simplification was an insult. She listened with the absolute stillness she brought to things that required her full attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You can see all of that," she said. Not a question. Not quite surprise. The quality of someone confirming something they had suspected. "Yes. And I want to understand it better. But not without your consent." She looked at him then, directly, with the banked coal eyes that had more depth in them than any eyes he had seen in this life. "Why does my consent matter to you?" The question was genuine. Not challenging. She actually wanted to know. "Because what I am asking to do is examine something that is yours at the most fundamental level. The architecture of what you are. That is not information anyone has a claim to without your agreement." He paused. "Also, any analysis performed without full cooperation is incomplete, because the subject will not be in their natural state. The data would be compromised. But primarily the first reason." She looked at him for a long time. The quality of the look was evaluative in a way that was different from Rei's evaluation or Hana's evaluation or any other evaluation he had been subjected to, because it was not measuring his capability, or his intelligence, or his trustworthiness in any conventional sense. It was measuring something underneath all of those things. "All right," she said. "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing specific. Simply be present, and not resist the observation." She nodded. He activated the Sharingan. And then, through the integrated 5-layer architecture with the forge running at its lowest analytical mode, he looked at Emika with the full capacity of everything he had built, and for the first time since his rebirth he encountered something that his architecture could perceive in full detail, but that exceeded his current theoretical framework entirely. She was not human, and something else. She was something that had been, very long ago, considerably more than human, compressed over time and lineage into a form that the world around her could tolerate, like a sun that had been patient enough to fit into a lantern. The energy Tsubaki had called old was old in the way that mountains were old, in the way that the deep ocean was old, in a register that made every other thing in Issei's experience feel recent. He looked at the architecture of it through the forge and understood, with the clarity that came from the integration weave providing all 5 functions simultaneously, what the bio-adaptive calibration framework that Hana had proposed would need to do to produce something that could serve this specific person's nature. The forge could work with this. Not easily. Not quickly. But the forge could work with this. "Thank you," he said, and deactivated the Sharingan. She was watching him with something in her expression that he recognized after a moment as relief, small and carefully contained but present. "You looked at me and did not look frightened," she said. "Should I have been? Most people who can perceive what I actually am are frightened. Or they want to use it. Or both." "I want to understand it," he said. "That is different from wanting to use it." She was quiet for a moment. "Then yes. It is." Somewhere behind them, around the warm light of the team camp, Tsubaki said something that made Katsu respond with a sound that was probably a laugh, and Rei said something in the measured tone she used when she was monitoring a situation without intervening, and the world moved on around this quiet moment at the edge of the trees. "I would like to make you something," Issei said. "When I have developed the architecture further. Something calibrated to what you actually are." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because what you are deserves tools built for it rather than tools built for something else and adapted inadequately." The banked coal eyes were steady for a long moment. "All right," she said for the second time that conversation, and this time the word carried something different in it. Not just consent. Something that had not yet decided what to call itself. Chapter 19. The resolution at the border. The best solution to a conflict is the one that leaves all parties with something they did not have before except for the conflict. The incursion group was led by a man named Goto, former chunin of a dissolved minor village, who had spent the preceding decade assembling the 12 rogue shinobi currently camped 4 kilometers west of the border village with the methodical patience of someone building towards something specific. Katsu had worked out the specifics by the end of the second day using the information Tsubaki's sensory network provided and cross-referencing it against the mission briefing's background data. The group was not performing random incursions. They were testing the border village's response capabilities in preparation for a larger action, the nature of which the mission briefing had not specified but which Katsu had narrowed to 2 likely options: extortion with escalating pressure or relocation, forcing the village population to move by making continued occupation untenable. The third possibility, Ray said during the evening planning session, is that they are working for someone whose interest is the land itself rather than the village. The border terrain has strategic value for anyone who wants to establish a permanent position between the 2 countries. That changes the intervention approach significantly, Issei said. How? Katsu said. If they are independent actors operating for their own benefit, resolving the situation requires neutralizing or redirecting their capability. If they are contracted, neutralizing their capability does not address the underlying interest. The contractor will simply send someone else. Katsu looked at him with the expression he used when Issei had said something that he had been about to say himself. We need to know who they are working for before we decide how to proceed, Ray said. Yes, Issei agreed. And we need the information quickly enough to incorporate it into the mission resolution. Which means we need someone inside the group's communication chain. He looked at the detection seal he had produced at his graduation practical, sitting in its case in his supply kit. The communication range of the prototype had been sufficient for within-village deployment. Over 3 months of development work he had extended it. I am going to place an information seal at their camp perimeter, he said. Passive, undetectable by standard chakra sensing, designed to intercept and record any communication that passes through its range. If they are receiving instructions from an outside party, the seal will capture it. Ray considered this for a moment. Deployment risk. Minimal if I go alone. The seal is small enough to be placed without physical penetration of the camp perimeter, and will not trigger any standard detection technique in their capability range. Tsubaki confirms their capability range, Ray said. Tsubaki, without being asked, gave a precise recitation of every chakra signature in the enemy camp and its associated technical capability, as she had assessed it over 2 days of sensory monitoring. 2 of the 12 had sensing ability. Neither reached beyond 200 meters at current activation levels. I can be at the placement point and back in 40 minutes, Issei said. Ray looked at him for a moment with the look that meant she had already made the decision, and was verifying his read of the situation before confirming it. 35, she said. I will count from now. He was back in 32. The information seal captured 3 communications over the following 16 hours. The first 2 were internal, coordination between Goto and his lieutenants regarding rotation schedules and supply inventory. The third was external, a brief chakra-encoded transmission from a direction Tsubaki identified as the Northern Merchant Road, using a cipher that Katsu cracked in 11 minutes and which revealed, with the elegant simplicity of intelligence that had not anticipated interception, the full scope of the operation. The contractor was a minor feudal lord with territorial ambitions and adequate resources to fund a prolonged pressure campaign. The incursion group had been paid for 6 months of border activity, with a completion bonus contingent on village abandonment. The lord's name was in the communication. So was the location of the payment transfer point. Katsu laid out the resolution approach with the economical precision he brought to strategy problems. The contractor is the source. Address the contractor and the incursion group loses its funding and its mission parameters simultaneously. The most efficient resolution does not require us to engage the incursion group at all. We are a genin team on AB rank, Ray said. Addressing a feudal lord is outside our mission scope. We are a genin team with a complete intelligence package that an appropriate authority can act on, Katsu said. Our mission scope is to stop the incursions. The method we recommend for stopping them is within our scope. The execution of that method, at the feudal lord level, is for someone else. We transmit the intelligence to the Hokage's office, Issei said, through the communication array I have deployed. The Hokage's office addresses the feudal lord through diplomatic channels. The contractor withdraws. The incursion group loses its purpose. And the village, Ray said? We provide the village headmen with a detection network that will give them advance warning of any future approach, Issei said. Permanent installation. Passive. Requires no active maintenance after calibration. They will not need Konoha assistance to monitor their own perimeter. The headman Kishi, when they presented this plan to her the following morning, listened with the focused attention of someone who had been in difficult situations before and knew the difference between a real offer and a politic one. You will leave a detection network, she said. Yes. And you will send the information to your Hokage. Already transmitted? She looked at him steadily. The network. How complex to maintain? I will train 2 people of your choice in the calibration maintenance. 2 hours of instruction. After that it is self-sustaining unless physically damaged. Kishi was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the seal tag he placed on the table between them, small and crystalline, and containing more engineering than any object of its size had any business containing. I have been a village headman for 20 years, she said. Konoha teams come through here and they help in the way that Konoha helps, which is competently, and with a cost that is paid later in ways we did not fully read in the agreement. She looked at him. You are 12 years old. Why is a 12-year-old the one explaining Konoha's offer to me? Because I am the one who built the network and I understand its capabilities most accurately, Issei said. The cost is what I described. The detection range, the maintenance requirements, the 2 hours of training. There is no delayed clause. And if the feudal lord's people come back with different contractors, the network will tell you they are coming. What you do with that information is your decision, as it should have always been. Another long silence. Then Kishi picked up the seal tag. Teach the 2 people, she said. And tell your Hokage that the border villages do not forget the difference between help and the appearance of help. I will, Issei said. And meant it. Chapter 20. What is being built? Power without purpose is spectacle. Purpose without power is aspiration. The point at which they meet is the only place where anything real can be made. They were home by the end of the week. Emika came with them, which was a development that Ray managed through the appropriate administrative channels with the particular efficient minimalism she brought to things she had decided were not open to significant debate. The mission report noted that a person of unusual capability had been encountered in circumstances that indicated Konoha's interest, which was true and specific enough to satisfy the review process, and general enough to avoid the kind of detailed attention that would complicate Emika's integration period. Issei wrote a supplementary technical report for the 3rd Hokage's personal review. It was thorough. He had been back 2 days when the summons arrived, not unexpected, in the measured formal language that the Hokage's office used when it wanted a meeting to have the weight of official attention without the pressure of formal procedure. He went alone, which was his choice, and he sat in the familiar chair across the familiar desk and looked at the 3rd with the direct attention that their previous meeting had established as the baseline for how they communicated. The 3rd had read the supplementary report. This was visible in the quality of his gaze, which had the particular density of someone who has absorbed a significant amount of information recently, and is still processing the implications. The girl, the 3rd said. Emika. Yes. Your assessment of her nature. She carries a divine heritage that has been in her lineage for at minimum several generations. The current expression in her body is strong enough to be operationally significant, and is currently entirely unguided. She has been using it through instinct and survival necessity rather than through any kind of developed framework. A framework that you intend to provide. I intend to develop one in collaboration with her, using the bio-adaptive principles from the forge layer design and new theoretical work that her specific nature will require. It will take time. The 3rd was quiet for a moment. His expression had the quality Issei associated with him thinking through implications rather than reaching conclusions. You are 12 years old, the 3rd said, and it was not what it had been the first time he had said it, a measure of surprise. It was something different now. Something that acknowledged a reality rather than questioned it. Yes. The seal architecture is at 5 layers. The forge is operational. You have begun producing alchemical composites, and the early material results are, by the assessment of every specialist I have asked to review your testing documentation, beyond the current state of the art in every relevant field. He paused. And you have now encountered something in the field that suggests the theoretical scope of the work extends further than your initial design implied. Further is one way to describe it. The more accurate description is that the initial design accounted for this possibility in general terms, and the encounter has provided specific data that allows the general terms to be replaced with precise ones. You planned for this. I planned for the category of event, not the specific instance. The third looked at him for a long moment. What do you need, he said, to continue the work? Issei had prepared for this question. He had been preparing for it since the first meeting, in the way that he prepared for all important conversations, by deciding in advance exactly what he would ask for if the opportunity arose and what the minimum acceptable version of that ask was if the full version was not available. Continued protection of the operational security around the architecture. What exists in the technical reports should remain at Hokage-level access and not circulate without your direct authorization. Done. Access to the restricted sealing archive for theoretical research. There are texts in the S-class collection that contain information relevant to the 6th layer design. A pause. Then, supervised access. You work in the archive with a Jonin present. Acceptable. An Emika status. Village resident under probationary observation. Standard protocol for individuals encountered outside standard identification pathways. The observation period to be managed by Jonin Yuzuki Rei, which she has already agreed to, rather than by the Standard Review Committee. The third looked at him steadily. You have already discussed this with Rei. I discuss everything with Rei. She is my team leader and the most reliable strategic resource I have access to. It would be poor practice not to. Something moved in the third's expression that might, in a different context, have been called amusement. The Standard Review Committee, he said, will not be satisfied with that arrangement. The Standard Review Committee is designed for standard situations. I am not arguing that the standard process lacks merit. I am arguing that Emika's specific situation requires an assessor who can understand what she is rather than applying a framework designed for what she is not. A pause. Rei is the only person besides myself with sufficient exposure to the relevant theoretical framework to assess her accurately. The third was quiet for a long moment. I will authorize the arrangement, he said, with the condition that you provide the review committee with a written briefing on the relevant theoretical framework within 30 days. Not the full technical documentation. A summary accessible to individuals without specialist background. 20 days, Issei said. The full version will be more useful than a summary in the long run, and I would rather write the full version correctly than the summary quickly. Another pause. Then 20 days. He nodded. He found Emika in the small room that had been allocated to her in the residential section of the village that handled transitional housing, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her back against the wall, and the window open to the afternoon. She looked up when he arrived. The banked coal eyes had the quality they had when she was not performing any particular expression for any particular audience, which was the quality he had come to think of as her actual face. It is settled, he said. You can stay. A pause. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. What does staying mean, she said. It means the village has acknowledged your presence and agreed to a process for determining your status. Rei is overseeing the process. It will take time, but the outcome is not in doubt. You are certain. I am certain of Rei's assessment capabilities, and I am certain of the argument I made to the Hokage. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. You argued for me. I argued for the most accurate and appropriate process. The outcome happens to align with your interest. The two are not always the same thing, but in this case they are. She absorbed this in the way she absorbed things, completely and without hurry. Thank you, she said. There is no need. There is, she said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been in enough situations where someone could have argued for them, and had not to understand clearly the difference when someone did. There is always need, when someone chooses to act on your behalf. The least that deserves is acknowledgement. He considered this. She was right, and the rightness of it had a specific quality he recognized as the quality of things that were true not just technically but at the level of how the world actually worked between people. "You are welcome," he said. She nodded. The afternoon light through the open window was warm and golden and fell across the floor in a pattern that was, by any objective measure, entirely ordinary. But the quality of the silence in the room was not ordinary. It was the silence of two people who had each spent the majority of their lives in their own interior worlds and were finding, with a mixture of caution and something approaching gladness, that the interior world of another person could be a place worth visiting. That evening, with the full team gathered in the small training hall that had become their de facto headquarters, Issei looked around the room at the people who occupied it. Rei, reviewing the mission after action report with the attention she gave to everything that needed to be learned from rather than simply filed. Tsubaki, sitting at the window with her eyes half closed and her sensory network extended into the village in its natural resting state, the way some people hum without thinking about it. Katsu, with a map and a set of counters that he moved with the patient deliberation of someone working through a problem that was at least 3 steps ahead of where anyone else in the room currently was. Hana, who had come by in the afternoon to review the material testing updates and had stayed for dinner and had not left, sitting now with the theoretical documentation spread before her and a brush in her hand making annotations with the focused efficiency that was her version of being completely at home, and Emika, sitting slightly apart in the way she always did, not excluded but choosing the edge in the manner of someone who had long been at edges and was not yet accustomed to the invitation to move toward the center. He looked at all of them and thought about what he was building, not the architecture, not the seal layers or the alchemical composites, or the theoretical framework for divine class weapons or the 6th layer whose design was already taking shape in the back of his mind with the particular clarity of a problem that has been approached from enough angles to finally resolve. What he was building beyond the architecture, Drake, in the constant and clear presence that the integration weave had made permanent, said nothing. He did not need to. They had been partners long enough that the dragon understood when Issei's silence was processing and when it was arrival. And this was arrival. For years ago he had been a boy with a dead dragon's ember in his chest and a journal full of questions and the absolute conviction, which he had never once examined because examining it would not have changed anything, that the questions were worth following wherever they led. They had led here. To this room. To these people. To a body that carried 5 layers of unprecedented architecture and could produce from raw material things that had not existed before he made them. To the edge of a 6th layer that he would spend the next year designing. To a war he could still see coming, distant but certain, its shape visible in the pattern of events the way the shape of weather is visible in the pressure of the air. He would be ready, not because he was certain of the outcome. Certainty about outcomes was for people who had not spent 4 years learning exactly how much could go wrong in any sufficiently complex system. He would be ready because the work was good and the people around it were extraordinary, and the architecture was sound and Drake was present and the world, whatever it brought next, would find him building toward it rather than waiting for it to arrive. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote at the top, in the clean deliberate hand he had developed over years of documentation, 6th layer. Designation, resonance crown. Purpose, full integration of personal architecture with external reality. Preliminary design phase begins tonight. He looked at the page. Then he looked at the room, at the light and the people and the ordinary extraordinary texture of a place where something unprecedented was being built by people who had chosen to be present for it. He picked up his pen. He began.